I am Harper, 33 years old, and a forensic accountant who makes a living uncovering financial fraud. At my 20th birthday party, I quietly transferred my entire multi-million-dollar inheritance from my grandparents into a blind trust just as a precaution. I always knew my family loved money more than they loved me. I had no idea that years later, my parents and my younger sister would actually forge documents to sell my estate behind my back. When they threw a $10,000 check in my face and told me to vacate my own property, they had no clue that the land they just sold to a massive investment group was entirely fake. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members who thought you were weak. The evening began at one of the most exclusive Michelin star restaurants in the city. The dining room was a masterpiece of modern elegance, with crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over white linen tablecloths and gleaming silver cutlery. I had arrived early wearing a new navy blazer, feeling a rare sense of pride. I had just been promoted to senior forensic investigator at my firm, a milestone I had worked 60-hour weeks to achieve. When my mother Victoria invited me to a family dinner, I foolishly assumed we were celebrating my promotion. I should have known better. In my family, the spotlight only ever shined on one person, my younger sister Chloe. Chloe arrived 20 minutes late, sweeping into the restaurant like she owned the entire building. She wore a designer dress that cost more than my monthly rent, her perfect blonde hair cascading over her shoulders. Beside her walked her husband, Marcus. Marcus was a 32-year-old African-American real estate developer with undeniable charisma, a brilliant smile, and an ego that consumed all the oxygen in the room. My parents absolutely adored him. He was ambitious, flashy, and represented the kind of high society wealth my parents, Thomas and Victoria, constantly chased to maintain their own status. We ordered expensive appetizers and bottles of wine that my father insisted on selecting to show off his refined palate. The conversation flowed rapidly around me, completely ignoring my presence. Chloe complained endlessly about the delayed renovations on her new luxury condo. Victoria praised Marcus for his recent feature in a local business magazine, leaning across the table to compliment his tailored suit. Thomas nodded along, treating Marcus more like a favored son than a son-in-law. I sat quietly, sipping my sparkling water, waiting for someone to ask about my week. Nobody did. I was used to being the invisible, boring spinster sister who worked with dry spreadsheets while Chloe lived a glamorous and exciting life. I had learned over the years to find peace in my quiet independence, far away from their constant need for external validation. When the main courses were cleared away by the attentive waitstaff, my father stood up. He picked up his crystal wine glass and tapped it lightly with a silver spoon. The sharp chiming sound cut through the low murmur of the restaurant. I sat up a little straighter and offered a genuine smile. I truly thought this was the moment. I thought my father was finally going to acknowledge my hard work, my recent promotion, and the fact that I had made a reputable name for myself in a highly competitive industry. I looked at my mother, but her eyes were fixed adoringly on Marcus. "I want to propose a toast," my father announced, his voice booming across our private corner of the dining room. "Tonight is a very special night for our family. We are gathered here to celebrate a monumental achievement. A deal that will cement our family legacy for generations to come." To Marcus and his incredible vision, my smile completely froze. I lowered my glass slowly, the familiar heavy feeling of disappointment settling deep in my chest. I watched as Marcus leaned back in his chair, exuding pure arrogance, while Chloe clapped enthusiastically like a cheerleader. I forced myself to maintain a neutral expression, refusing to let them see how much it hurt to be cast aside yet again. My father continued, puffing out his chest with immense pride. "As you all know, Marcus has been working tirelessly to secure a major acquisition for his development firm, and today the paperwork was officially finalized. His firm has successfully acquired the 50-acre lakefront estate. It is going to be the site of the most luxurious eco-resort in the entire state." The air violently left my lungs. The 50-acre lakefront estate. That was my property. It was the land my grandparents had left exclusively to me when they passed away. It featured a beautiful rustic wooden cabin where I spent my weekends reading by the fire and escaping the relentless noise of the city. My grandfather had explicitly kept that specific property out of my parents' hands because he knew they would eagerly pave over the pristine nature to make a quick buck. He trusted me to protect it. I stared at my father, my mind racing in absolute panic, trying to comprehend his words. I am sure you are all wondering about the details, Marcus said, taking over the spotlight with his smooth, practiced voice. We secured $15 million in investor capital this morning. The zoning permits are being fast-tracked by the mayor's office as we speak. This resort is going to put my firm on the national map. And I could not have done it without Thomas and Victoria helping me navigate the family assets to secure the deed. My mother beamed, reaching over to pat Marcus affectionately on the hand. You deserve it, Marcus. You have the ambition and the drive this family desperately needs. I sat there, my hands gripping the linen napkin in my lap so tightly my knuckles turned white. I looked at the four of them celebrating a multi-million-dollar real estate deal on land that legally belonged to me. They were clinking glasses, laughing out loud, toasting to a future built on stolen ground. The sheer audacity was paralyzing. They were not just talking about a random business transaction. They were talking about destroying my sanctuary, my legal inheritance, and the only pure memory I still had of my grandparents. My father reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a sleek leather checkbook, clicked his expensive pen, and scribbled something down with a flourish. He tore the check from the book and tossed it casually across the table. It fluttered in the air before landing right next to my water glass. I looked down at it. It was a check made out to me for exactly $10,000. This is for you, Harper, my father said, his tone entirely dismissive, as if he were tipping a valet driver. I know you like spending your weekends reading in that old dusty cabin out there, but progress cannot wait for sentimentality. That check should more than cover the cost of moving your old books and whatever junk you have lying around. Consider it a generous relocation fee from the firm. I looked from the check up to my father's expectant face. You want me to relocate? I repeated, keeping my voice dangerously level. From my own property. It is Marcus's property now, my mother corrected sharply, her eyes narrowing at me. He closed the deal today. Do not be difficult, Harper. We are having a wonderful evening, and we will not let your usual negativity ruin Marcus's celebration. You need to clear out of the lake house by Monday morning. Marcus has bulldozers scheduled to arrive at noon to begin the demolition. Monday morning. They were giving me exactly 2 days to empty out my entire inheritance so they could tear it down to the ground. Chloe leaned over, resting her chin on her hand, her diamond ring catching the bright restaurant light. Oh, Harper, do not look so dramatic. It is just an old rotting cabin in the woods. You should be thanking Marcus for giving you $10,000. With your boring salary, you would never see that kind of money all at once. Go buy yourself some nice clothes or something. You really need an upgrade. The four of them stared at me, waiting for me to break down, waiting for me to cry or scream so they could call me unstable and crazy like they always did. But they had fundamentally misunderstood who I was. I was a forensic accountant. I spent my life dismantling fraudulent empires and sending arrogant white-collar criminals to federal prison. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just stared at that $10,000 check and felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over my mind. I stared at the $10,000 check sitting on the pristine white tablecloth. The slip of paper had just been casually slid across to me by my own father, accompanied by the devastating announcement that my sister's husband Marcus was sending bulldozers to demolish my lake house by Monday morning. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply folded my hands neatly in my lap and looked directly into my father's eyes. How exactly did you sell a deed that bears my name? I asked. The question was purely clinical, devoid of the hysterical emotion my family was so desperately waiting for. Chloe burst into a high-pitched theatrical laugh. She threw her head back and raised her left hand to carelessly brush a stray blonde curl from her face, deliberately making sure the massive new diamond on her ring finger caught the light of the restaurant's crystal chandelier. It was a flawless, radiant cut stone, easily 5 carats, and undoubtedly purchased with the funds from my stolen inheritance. Oh, Harper, Chloe sighed, shaking her head with a look of profound, mocking pity. You really are so utterly oblivious to the real world. You are 33 years old. You are hopelessly single. You spend your Friday nights auditing spreadsheets and drinking cheap wine in a cramped apartment. What were you ever going to do with 50 acres of prime lakefront real estate, build a sanctuary for stray cats, start a commune for boring accountants? We did you a massive favor. A favor? I repeated, my tone remaining utterly flat. By committing real estate fraud. My mother Victoria scoffed loudly, waving her manicured hand dismissively. Do not use such ugly words, Harper. There was no fraud involved. Everything was done completely by the book. Your father and I simply utilized a pre-existing legal framework to manage an asset that was going to waste. What legal framework, I asked, though my mind was already racing ahead, sifting through our family history and piecing together the timeline of their deception. My father leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He wore the smug, satisfied expression of a man who believed he had just pulled off the heist of the century. 13 years ago, when you were 20, you were in that minor car accident. You suffered a concussion and were kept in the hospital overnight for observation. As your parents, we filed for temporary medical and legal guardianship to handle your affairs while you were incapacitated. I stared at him as the sheer audacity of their scheme crystallized in my mind. I was in the hospital for exactly 24 hours. That was over a decade ago. And we never officially filed the paperwork to dissolve that temporary conservatorship. My mother interjected smoothly, taking a delicate sip of her Chardonnay. It remained dormant in the county records. When Marcus brought us this incredible development opportunity, your father and I consulted with a very creative attorney. We quietly reactivated that old guardianship clause citing your current single status and supposed inability to manage complex property taxes, and we transferred the deed into a holding company controlled by the family. We then sold that company to Marcus. It was completely seamless. They were gaslighting me right to my face. They sat there in their designer clothes drinking expensive wine, calmly explaining how they had hijacked my legal autonomy, using a decade-old fender bender as an excuse to steal millions of dollars from me. And they genuinely expected me to be grateful. You do not know the first thing about land management, Harper. My father added, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made my stomach turn. The property taxes alone on a 50-acre estate would bankrupt you eventually. It is a dead asset, a liability. We are cashing out that liability and putting the land to work. You should be thanking us for lifting that massive financial burden off your shoulders. We even made sure Marcus cut you a check for $10,000. That is more than fair for an overgrown swamp and a rotting wooden cabin. Marcus finally spoke up, leaning back in his chair and spreading his arms wide. He exuded the unchecked arrogance of a man who believed he had just conquered the world. Your parents are right, Harper. You have to look at the bigger picture here. This is about legacy. I just secured $15 million in investor capital for this luxury resort project. $15 million. Do you have any idea how much leverage that gives our family? He leaned in closer, his eyes gleaming with greed. The investors are absolutely thrilled. They love the vision I presented. We are building a world-class destination. A high-end spa and infinity pool, a 5-star dining experience right on the water. We officially break ground on Monday morning. Your little cabin was just standing in the way of progress. Do not worry, though, I will make sure they name one of the hiking trails after you. A nice quiet path for you to walk on when you come visit. The table fell silent. My parents and my sister watched me eagerly. They were waiting for the explosion. They wanted me to yell to cause a scene to prove their narrative that I was an unstable, dramatic spinster who could not handle adult business decisions. They wanted me to validate the very excuse they used to steal my land. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm. As a forensic accountant, I spent my days tracking hidden money, unraveling complex corporate fraud, and watching arrogant men, exactly like Marcus, build houses of cards that inevitably collapsed under scrutiny. I knew something they did not. I knew that the deed they had so cleverly transferred using a dormant guardianship loophole was completely worthless. I knew the $15 million Marcus had just raised was tied to a piece of land that could never be developed. I did not need to scream. I did not need to argue. I just needed to let them dig their own graves. I caught the eye of our waiter, who had been hovering nervously near the edge of the dining room. I raised my hand slightly, signaling him over. He approached our table with hesitant steps. "I will take the check for the table, please," I said politely. My mother frowned, her perfectly drawn eyebrows pulling together in confusion. "Harper, what are you doing? Marcus is paying for dinner. This is his celebration." "Not tonight," I replied, pulling my sleek black corporate credit card from my purse. The waiter handed me the leather billfold. I did not even look at the total. I placed my card inside and handed it right back to him. "You cannot afford this dinner, Harper," Chloe sneered, rolling her eyes. "Stop being embarrassing. Just take your little $10,000 check and go home." The waiter returned a moment later, handing me the receipt. I signed it with a steady hand, added a generous 30% tip, and stood up from the table. I smoothed the wrinkles from my navy blazer and picked up my purse. I looked down at the $10,000 check still sitting next to my father's wineglass. "Keep the check, Dad," I said, my voice carrying the cool, detached professionalism I used in the courtroom. "You are going to need every single penny of it." I did not wait for their response. I turned my back on my parents, my sister, and her smug husband. I walked across the dining room, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the restaurant and stepped out into the crisp, cool night air. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the scent of the city, and allowed a small, sharp smile to finally touch my lips. They thought they had outsmarted me. They had no idea that the game had not even started yet. I woke up early the next morning, enveloped in the quiet serenity of the lake house. The morning mist still clung to the surface of the water, and the scent of pine needles filled the crisp air. I sat on the back porch with a mug of black coffee, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. I knew the peace would not last. My family never possessed the patience to let their victims breathe. At exactly 8 o'clock, the crunch of heavy tires on the gravel driveway shattered the morning calm. I walked back inside and set my mug on the kitchen counter, just as the heavy oak front door swung open without a single knock. Victoria marched into the foyer, clutching a clipboard like a weapon. Right behind her was Chloe, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and holding an iced matcha latte. They were followed by a crew of 4 burly men in matching gray uniforms, carrying stacks of flattened cardboard boxes and rolls of heavy packing tape. Victoria barked orders at the men with military precision. "Start in the living room, pack everything. If it looks like garbage, throw it in the dumpster outside. We need this place stripped to the studs by noon." She turned and finally acknowledged me, standing quietly in the kitchen. "Good you are awake." I told Marcus we would handle the eviction logistics so he could focus on managing the investor capital. "Do not just stand there, Harper. Start packing your clothes. We are on a very tight schedule." The moving crew did not waste a single second. They unfolded the cheap, flimsy cardboard boxes and began throwing my possessions inside with absolute zero regard for care. I watched one of the men grab a stack of my antique first edition books and drop them unceremoniously into a box, crushing the delicate corners against the cardboard. I did not flinch. Material things could easily be replaced. The satisfaction of watching this entire operation completely collapse would be priceless. Chloe leaned against the granite kitchen island, sipping her green drink and watching the movers with obvious amusement. "You always make things so difficult," she sighed, shaking her head in mock pity. "You could have just accepted the $10,000 and left quietly. But no, you had to perform that little stunt with the credit card last night to try and embarrass us. You are so bitter, Harper. It is exactly like what you did at my bachelorette party." I kept my face perfectly blank, remembering the incident she was referencing perfectly well. Chloe had demanded I pay $30,000 to fund a 2-week luxury yacht trip in Mykonos for her, and 10 of her friends claiming it was my basic duty as the older working sister to sponsor her life milestones. When I logically refused to empty my savings for her party, Victoria had accused me of destroying the sacred family bond. Victoria marched into the kitchen, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. Your sister is entirely right. You have never been a team player. You have always been selfish and narrow-minded. Do you remember Thanksgiving 3 years ago? Marcus generously offered you the exclusive chance to invest your life savings into his tech startup. You refused and you humiliated him in front of the entire extended family by pointing out flaws in his business model. You ruined the holiday because you could not bear to see a younger, smarter, more charismatic man succeed where you failed. The tech startup she mentioned had gone completely bankrupt exactly 6 months later, entirely wiping out the investments of everyone foolish enough to buy into Marcus's flashy presentation. I had saved myself from total financial ruin simply by reading the fine print of his contracts. But in my family's twisted, distorted reality, my financial literacy was viewed as a deliberate personal attack against their golden boy. I ignored their taunts. I walked past my mother and sister heading straight for my home office at the far end of the hallway. I did not grab clothes, expensive jewelry, or sentimental photographs. I went straight to my heavy mahogany desk and pulled out my sleek silver laptop. I slipped it carefully into my leather tote bag. Then I knelt on the hardwood floor and opened the hidden floor safe concealed beneath a woven Persian rug. I took out a heavy locked steel briefcase. Inside that briefcase was the complete authenticated legal documentation of Phoenix Holdings, the blind trust that held the true impenetrable deed to the core 50 acres of the estate. It also contained the encrypted hard drives and the specialized forensic software I needed to completely dismantle Marcus's fraudulent real estate empire. This briefcase was my absolute power. I walked back into the main living room, gripping the locked briefcase firmly in my right hand. The movers had already stripped the room completely bare. The beautiful rustic space where I had spent countless weekends reading by the roaring fire now looked like a sterile, abandoned warehouse. Cheap cardboard boxes were stacked haphazardly against the wooden walls. Victoria stood in the center of the chaos, checking items off her clipboard with aggressive pen strokes. "Is that all you are taking?" Victoria asked, eyeing my tote bag and the steel briefcase with distinct disapproval. "We are certainly not paying for a climate-controlled storage unit for the rest of this junk. Whatever you leave behind will go straight to the county landfill by tomorrow morning." "You can do whatever you want with the furniture, Victoria," I said, dropping the title of mother entirely. It felt freeing to finally sever that verbal tie. I have absolutely everything I need right here. Chloe laughed a sharp, mocking sound, adjusting her designer sunglasses as she looked me up and down. "Enjoy your miserable little apartment, Harper. Try not to cry too much when you see Marcus and me cutting the ceremony ribbon on national television next week. It is going to be the biggest event of the year and you are not invited." I did not offer them a parting insult. I did not give them the satisfaction of a drawn-out emotional argument. I simply walked out the front door, the gravel crunching loudly beneath my heavy boots, and got into my car. I put the keys in the ignition, glancing in the rearview mirror one last time to see my family standing triumphantly on the porch of the house they firmly believed they had stolen. I smiled, shifted the car into drive, and drove down the winding path, letting them believe they had won the battle. They had absolutely no idea I had already won the war. I finally reached the end of the gravel driveway when a black Range Rover blocked my path. The tinted window rolled down to reveal Marcus. He raised a hand, signaling me to stop. I kept my expression neutral as I rolled down my window. Marcus cut the engine and stepped out. He walked toward my car with a slow swagger, adjusting his silk tie. He leaned his forearms against my open window, invading my personal space with the heavy scent of designer cologne. "Leaving so soon, Harper?" he asked, a smug grin on his face. "I saw the moving truck earlier. Victoria runs a tight ship. I assume the cabin is empty by now." "The house is empty, Marcus. You got what you wanted. If you do not mind moving your vehicle, I have a drive back to the city." Marcus did not move. Instead, he let out a patronizing chuckle and shook his head. He looked at me with an expression of exaggerated fake pity. "You know, Harper, I was talking to Chloe last night." He began, his voice dripping with condescension. "We discussed your situation. You are 33 years old, living alone in a cramped apartment, scraping by on whatever meager salary an accountant makes. As the man of this family, I feel an obligation to make sure you do not fall apart. I just stared. He had orchestrated the theft of my multi-million-dollar inheritance, and now he stood in my driveway pretending to be the benevolent patriarch. "What exactly are you getting at, Marcus?" I asked, injecting enough weariness into my voice to make him believe I was defeated. He stood up straight, brushing dust from his lapel. "I am offering you a lifeline, Harper. A chance to be part of something real. This eco-resort is going to be a massive undertaking with $15 million in initial capital. I need someone to handle the basic day-to-day bookkeeping for the site." He paused, letting the insult hang heavily in the air. He was offering a senior forensic investigator a job doing basic data entry. It was the ultimate slap in the face. "It is a simple job." He continued, his tone implying a child could do it. "You just log the receipts, track the daily contractor expenses, and make sure the petty cash balances out at the end of the week. Nothing too complex. Nothing that will overwhelm you. It pays a modest hourly wage, but for a single woman in your position, a steady paycheck is exactly what you need right now." I looked down at my hands. My mind raced at lightning speed. Marcus was handing me the keys to his entire fraudulent kingdom. He was so blinded by his own ego that he did not realize the catastrophic mistake he was making. By putting me in charge of his construction bookkeeping, he was giving me direct access to his internal financial networks. I would be able to see every invoice, track every contractor payment, and monitor exactly how he was siphoning investor capital to fund his and Chloe's lavish lifestyle. It was the greatest gift he could have possibly given me. But I knew I had to play my part perfectly. If I accepted too quickly, his natural paranoia might kick in. I needed to feed his massive ego. I needed to let him see the broken, humiliated woman he so desperately wanted me to be. I let out a slow, shuddering sigh. I allowed my shoulders to slump forward, breaking my perfect posture. I looked up at him, making sure my eyes reflected pure defeat. "I do not know, Marcus," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Working for you and Chloe after everything that just happened today feels incredibly humiliating." Marcus ate it up. His smile widened into a triumphant grin. He leaned back into the window frame, thoroughly enjoying his absolute power over me. "Pride does not pay the rent, Harper," he said coldly. "You need to swallow your pride and face reality. Your parents are not going to bail you out anymore. Chloe has her own life to focus on. This is a one-time offer. You can either take this job and earn an honest living under my supervision, or you can drive away right now and figure out how to survive on your own. Do not expect any more handouts from this family." I closed my eyes for a brief second, pretending to weigh the heavy burden of my supposedly miserable existence. When I opened them, I looked at him with the hollow, defeated gaze of a woman who had completely surrendered. "Okay," I said quietly, my voice trembling just a fraction. "I will take the job. I need the money." Marcus chuckled, stepping away from the car. "I knew you would see reason eventually. Report to my main corporate office downtown on Monday morning at 8 sharp. My assistant will set you up in a cubicle near the supply closet. Do not be late, Harper. I run a highly professional operation and do not tolerate laziness even from my wife's sister." I nodded meekly, keeping my hands tight on the steering wheel. "I will be there, Marcus. Thank you." He turned his back on me and walked to his Range Rover with the swagger of a king. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and backed out of the way, clearing my path to the main road. I drove slowly past him, keeping my eyes fixed straight ahead. I maintained the facade of misery until I was out of his sight, turning onto the highway. Once I was safely miles away from the estate, the heavy posture vanished. I straightened my spine and let out a sharp laugh. Marcus believed he had chained me to a desk to humiliate me. He believed he had asserted his total dominance over his boring older sister. He had no idea he had just invited the executioner straight into his castle. On Monday morning, I walked through the towering glass doors of Marcus's downtown development firm exactly at 8 o'clock. The reception area was a masterclass in modern pretension, featuring imported Italian marble floors, a cascading indoor water wall, and a massive brushed steel logo of his company mounted prominently behind the reception desk. The entire aesthetic screamed aggressive success, designed specifically to awe potential investors the moment they stepped off the private elevator. Marcus's assistant, a nervous young woman named Jessica, met me in the lobby and escorted me past the spacious sunlit glass offices overlooking the city skyline. She led me down a narrow, poorly lit corridor at the very back of the floor plan, stopping at a tiny, windowless cubicle, wedged directly between the humming server room and the employee supply closet. "This is your desk, Harper," she said apologetically, handing me a laminated sheet of paper with generic login credentials. "Marcus said you only need access to the basic expense portal." I thanked her and took my seat. The chair was cheap and unyielding. The desk barely had enough room to accommodate my laptop. It was the absolute perfect hiding spot. The moment Jessica's heels clicked away down the hall, I plugged my encrypted flash drive into the network. Marcus had instructed his IT department to give me read-only access to a superficial ledger, a highly sanitized spreadsheet where contractor invoices for the eco-resort were neatly logged. To the untrained eye, it looked like a standard operational budget for early-stage land development. But a forensic accountant never stops at the surface. Within 10 minutes, I deployed a customized data scraping script I had written specifically for corporate audits. Marcus's cybersecurity was incredibly weak, built on off-the-shelf firewalls that prioritized operational speed over actual financial protection. I bypassed his administrative blocks with terrifying ease, creating an invisible backdoor entry directly into his primary financial servers. The screen flickered, and suddenly the entire nervous system of his real estate empire laid completely bare before my eyes. I located the central escrow account containing the $15 million in investor capital. My heart hammered a steady rhythm against my ribs as I began tracing the outgoing wire transfers. The tension in that small cubicle was palpable. Every time a shadow crossed the frosted glass at the end of the hallway, I kept a hotkey ready to snap my screen back to the mundane contractor spreadsheet. I worked with relentless speed, cross-referencing bank routing numbers and analyzing the metadata of every single transaction over the past 6 months. Forensic accounting is essentially digital bloodhound work. You follow the scent of the money, no matter how many times a desperate criminal tries to wash it clean. Marcus was running a classic highly illegal shell game. He had set up half a dozen limited liability companies registered in Delaware and Nevada, all carrying vague corporate-sounding names like Apex Consulting Solutions, Horizon Design Group, and Summit Environmental Logistics. On paper, Marcus was funneling massive payouts from the $15 million investor pool into these external companies, labeling the outbound transactions as architectural consulting, environmental impact studies, and luxury procurement fees. But as I peeled back the layered ownership of those shell corporations, tracing the registered agents and following the destination accounts, the brilliant, successful facade Marcus had built completely shattered. Apex Consulting Solutions was not a high-end architectural firm. It was a dummy account linked directly to an exclusive European auto dealership. Marcus had not purchased heavy construction materials. He had wired $350,000 of investor capital to buy himself a custom matte black Lamborghini, writing it off in the ledger as a company transport vehicle for site visits. Horizon Design Group was not an environmental consulting agency. It was a secondary account set up to continuously funnel money directly into my sister's personal checking account. I pulled up my phone and watched the transaction timestamps line up perfectly with Chloe's boastful social media posts. The $75,000 consulting fee approved last Tuesday perfectly matched the purchase price of the limited edition Hermes bags and Cartier jewelry she had paraded around the family dinner, blindly flaunting stolen investor funds. A sudden $200,000 site surveying expense was actually routed directly to a private aviation company to charter a jet for a spontaneous luxury vacation to Bora Bora. It was a staggering, absolute feeding frenzy of embezzlement. Marcus was not building a luxury resort. He was using $15 million of other people's money as his own personal piggy bank to fund a fraudulent lifestyle. I downloaded every single forged invoice, every fake expense report, and every wire transfer receipt. I took digital snapshots of the routing numbers and backed up the heavily encrypted data to 3 separate remote servers located outside the building. The sheer arrogance of his fraud was almost insulting to my profession. He had barely bothered to cover his tracks, assuming that no one in his inner circle was smart enough to question his authority, and confident that the wealthy investors were too blinded by his charisma to audit his books. He had hired me to input trivial receipts, believing I was too broken, too depressed, and too humiliated to notice the millions of dollars hemorrhaging from his accounts. I sat in that cramped, windowless cubicle for 9 straight hours, meticulously compiling a digital guillotine. Every time Marcus strolled past the hallway barking orders into his cell phone and acting like a visionary tycoon, I simply kept my head down and continued typing. My fingers flew across the keyboard, locking away the undeniable, irrefutable proof of federal wire fraud and grand larceny. By the time 5 o'clock rolled around, the trap was fully loaded. I logged out of the system, packed my laptop into my bag, and walked out of the building. I smiled into the evening air, knowing I held the keys to his absolute destruction. Tuesday morning brought clinical focus. I returned to my cramped cubicle and bypassed Marcus's security protocols just as I had the day before. The thrill of uncovering the embezzlement settled into a methodical drive. A forensic audit is never complete until every cent is accounted for. Marcus flaunted $15 million from investors, but the operating costs showed a sudden cash injection of $2 million predating that funding. This money secured the aggressive marketing campaigns, environmental bribes, and lavish gala deposits needed to attract heavy hitters. I ran a targeted search algorithm through his internal communications and encrypted email archives, scanning for unlisted wire transfers. An hour later, my script flagged a hidden password-protected folder buried deep within a directory labeled Miscellaneous Administrative Overhead. The password was predictably weak, simply Chloe's birth date followed by a $sign. When the folder decrypted and snapped open on my screen, I found a digital paper trail that made my breath catch in my throat. It was not another shell company or a stolen investor fund. It was a series of scanned legal documents, promissory notes, and a massive wire transfer receipt. I clicked on the primary PDF file and zoomed in on the signatures at the bottom of the page. The looping, arrogant cursive belonged to my father, Thomas. The sharp, meticulously slanted handwriting next to it belonged to my mother, Victoria. My eyes darted to the top of the document. It was a private lending agreement for exactly $2 million wired directly into Marcus's personal holding account, just 3 weeks before my 20th birthday inheritance was stolen. My parents were not just cheering Marcus on from the sidelines, they were his primary seed investors. I dug faster, pulling up the origination documents attached to the wire transfer. My parents did not have $2 million in liquid cash sitting in a checking account. Their wealth had always been tied up in depreciating assets and an obsessive need to maintain appearances. They had to get that money from somewhere. I opened the next file and felt a genuine shock resonate through my chest. It was a second mortgage agreement. My parents had secretly leveraged their sprawling gated mansion in the suburbs to secure a hard money loan from a predatory private lending firm known for funding high-risk commercial developments. The terms of the loan were absolutely catastrophic. In their desperation to fund Marcus's grand vision and secure a massive immediate payout from the resort project, my parents had agreed to an exorbitant variable interest rate with a balloon payment due in less than 6 months. They had signed away all their equity, completely bypassing traditional banking regulations to get their hands on the cash fast. I sat back in my cheap office chair, the harsh fluorescent light of the cubicle buzzing above me. I read the default clauses of the loan agreement, again making sure I was not misunderstanding the legal jargon. It was crystal clear. The loan was entirely secured against their primary residence. If Marcus failed to break ground, if the resort project stalled, or if the $15 million in investor capital dried up, Marcus would default on his obligations to my parents. Without that massive return on investment from the eco-resort, Thomas and Victoria would completely default on their predatory mortgage. The private lenders would immediately foreclose on their multi-million-dollar mansion. They would be evicted, stripped of their assets, and left completely destitute. They would be thrown out onto the street with nothing but the designer clothes on their backs. The sheer poetic irony of the situation was staggering. My parents had spent my entire life calling me a failure. They had mocked my steady, reliable career. They had treated me like a financial burden and an embarrassment. Just 2 days ago, they had looked me in the eye and handed me a pathetic $10,000 check, acting as if they were performing a grand act of charity, while simultaneously orchestrating the theft of my 50-acre estate. They had justified stealing my grandfather's land by claiming I was too incompetent to manage it. Yet behind their smug smiles and condescending lectures, they had secretly bet their entire existence on a fraudulent scam run by a charismatic con artist. They had quite literally wagered their home, their social status, and their financial survival on the very property they stole from me. They believed Marcus was a real estate visionary who was going to double their net worth and elevate their status among the city's elite. They had no idea he was using their $2 million seed money to lease private jets for their golden child Chloe. They had blindly handed him the keys to their lives, trusting his flashy presentations over basic financial due diligence. If they had simply asked me, the daughter they constantly belittled, to run a basic audit on his firm, I could have saved them from total ruin. But their arrogance had blinded them. They wanted the quick payout. They wanted the prestige of the luxury resort. They wanted to destroy my sanctuary to build their empire. I minimized the mortgage documents on my screen and transferred secure copies to my encrypted external drive. I locked the files away alongside the evidence of Marcus's embezzlement. The scope of my operation had just expanded massively. This was no longer just about taking down a fraudulent brother-in-law and reclaiming my stolen inheritance. This was about allowing my parents to reap the absolute, unfiltered consequences of their own greed. They had tied themselves to a sinking ship, completely unaware that the hull was already compromised. If I exposed Marcus right now, the investors would pull their capital, the project would die, and the predatory lenders would seize my parents' mansion immediately. But doing it now would be too easy. It would spare them the brutal, highly public humiliation they so richly and thoroughly deserve to experience. It would spare them the brutal, highly public humiliation they so richly and thoroughly deserve to experience. During my lunch hour on Wednesday, I stepped out of Marcus's suffocating office building and walked 3 blocks to a high-security private depository. The crisp afternoon air did little to cool the fire burning in my chest. I presented my credentials to the armed guard at the entrance, submitted to a retinal scan, and was escorted down to the vaults. The heavy steel door of my personal safety deposit box clicked open with a satisfying mechanical clunk. Inside lay a thick stack of aged, notarized legal documents. I ran my fingers over the embossed seal on the top folder. The label simply read, Phoenix Holdings. Looking at that name always transported me back to the exact moment my innocence regarding my family had finally died. It was the moment I realized that blood meant absolutely nothing when money was on the table. It was 13 years ago, the evening of my 20th birthday. I had come home from college for the weekend, expecting a quiet family dinner to celebrate. Instead, I walked into the empty foyer of my parents' mansion and heard hushed, urgent voices echoing from my father's private study. I crept down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the Persian runners. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. I peered through the narrow gap and saw Thomas and Victoria sitting across from a local real estate attorney they often used for their aggressive acquisitions. They were not discussing a birthday present or planning a surprise party for me. They were meticulously plotting to trick my grandfather out of his 50-acre lakefront estate. My grandfather's physical health had begun to decline, but his mind remained as sharp as a tack. My parents, however, saw his physical frailty as a golden opportunity. Victoria paced the length of the study, complaining bitterly about how her own father was wasting prime commercial real estate by refusing to sell the land to a corporate resort developer. Thomas leaned over the mahogany desk, asking the lawyer how quickly they could declare my grandfather medically incompetent. If they could not force him into a conservatorship, Their backup plan was to bury him in fraudulent property tax assessments until he was forced to sign the deed over to them just to survive the financial pressure. They spoke about his potential ruin with cold, calculating enthusiasm. I did not burst into the room and confront them. Even at 20 years old, I knew that confronting liars only taught them to hide their lies better. I quietly backed away from the study door, slipped out the front entrance, and drove my college sedan straight to the lake house. I found my grandfather sitting on the wooden porch, watching the water gently lap against the shore. I fell into his arms and told him everything I had just overheard. He did not act surprised or shocked. He simply sighed, stroking my hair, and told me he had known for years that his daughter and son-in-law were circling his assets like vultures. He looked me in the eye and said he wanted to leave the entire estate to me. But we both knew that if he simply willed it to me, my parents would instantly challenge the document in probate court and tie me up in endless litigation. The next morning, my grandfather and I bypassed local county lawyers completely. We drove to a wealth protection firm in the city. We sat down with a brilliant estate attorney and crafted a masterpiece of legal defense. We established Phoenix Holdings an irrevocable blind trust. The trust absorbed the core 48 acres of the estate, including the lake house and all the pristine waterfront property. My grandfather transferred absolute legal ownership to the trust, making me the sole hidden beneficiary and the executive director upon his death. The beauty of a blind trust was its total opacity. My parents could search public county records for decades and never find my name attached to the core property. As far as the public record was concerned, Phoenix Holdings was a faceless corporate entity. But a fortress is only secure if the enemy stops trying to breach the walls. We needed a decoy. We needed to give my parents a target they thought they could hit so they would stop looking for the rest of the land. We carved out a worthless 2-acre strip of undevelopable swampland on the outermost edge of the property line. We legally separated this dummy parcel from the main estate and registered it directly in my personal name. Furthermore, we deliberately tied the deed of that swamp parcel to a minor medical guardianship clause stemming from a car accident I had suffered a few months prior. I had spent 24 hours in the hospital, and my parents had temporarily held my medical proxy. We left that tiny legal window cracked open on purpose. We structured the trap so that if my parents ever tried to steal my inheritance behind my back, they would find that specific loophole. They would successfully force a transfer of the deed using their old guardianship papers, entirely unaware that the deed they were stealing only applied to the toxic 2-acre swamp. To make the trap truly lethal, we quietly transferred all of the historical massive environmental tax liabilities and remediation debts from the entire original estate directly onto that single decoy parcel. Anyone who claimed ownership of that specific deed would instantly inherit millions of dollars in environmental cleanup fines from the state. I stood in the vault staring at the perfectly executed documents. 13 years ago, I had laid a trap in the dark, waiting patiently for the day their overwhelming greed would finally outgrow their caution. Marcus and my parents thought they had orchestrated a brilliant corporate heist. They thought they had ripped the ground right out from under my feet and left me with nothing. In reality, they had gleefully walked right into the cage I built for them when I was barely out of my teens. Marcus had raised $15 million from aggressive investors to build a world-class luxury resort on a 2-acre toxic swamp that carried massive unresolvable government debts. I locked the metal box, slid it securely back into the vault, and walked out into the sunlight. The trap had snapped shut. Now I just had to watch them bleed. I returned to Marcus's sleek downtown office after my lunch break with a renewed sense of purpose. The stale air of my windowless cubicle no longer felt like a prison. It felt like an operations command center. I sat down in my cheap squeaky chair, woke up my laptop, and bypassed the firewall for the third time that week. I needed absolute, undeniable confirmation that Marcus and my parents had fallen into the specific snare I had left for them. I navigated past the embezzlement folders and accessed the legal and compliance directory of Marcus's real estate firm. My fingers danced across the keyboard as I pulled up the official property transfer documents my parents had executed. I opened the deed transfer file and zoomed in on the surveyor's addendum. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon until I found the exact assessor's parcel number. My heart hammered a steady, triumphant rhythm in my chest. The number matched perfectly. They had not acquired the 50-acre lakefront estate. They had legally purchased parcel number 409, the exact 2-acre strip of toxic, undevelopable marshland on the extreme eastern edge of the property boundary. They had taken the bait hook, line, and sinker. In their blind, greedy rush to steal my inheritance, neither my father nor Marcus had bothered to hire an independent surveyor to verify the property boundaries. Marcus simply trusted Thomas, assuming his wealthy father-in-law already knew the exact dimensions of the family estate. Thomas and Victoria, driven purely by their vindictive desire to disinherit me and secure a quick payout, had relied entirely on the decoy paperwork they found in the county clerk's office. They saw a deed bearing my name, noticed the old medical guardianship loophole, and aggressively seized it without performing a single shred of basic due diligence. I pulled up the state environmental database using a secure proxy server and punched in Marcus's newly acquired parcel number. The screen instantly populated with a staggering list of red flags, government liens, and severe ecological restrictions. Decades ago, long before my grandfather purchased the main estate, a small chemical manufacturing facility had illegally dumped industrial waste on that specific 2-acre strip. The soil was heavily contaminated with lead arsenic and chemical runoff. The state's Environmental Protection Agency had placed a permanent, non-negotiable freeze on any commercial or residential development for that exact piece of land. But the genius of my grandfather's legal structuring was not just the physical toxicity of the land. It was the financial toxicity attached to the deed. The environmental remediation debts and back taxes on that 2-acre swamp totaled just over $4 million. For the past 13 years, those debts had been quietly sitting dormant because the land was technically owned by a private individual making no attempt to commercialize it. However, the exact moment a corporate entity like Marcus's development firm acquired the deed with the stated intent to break ground, those dormant liabilities were instantly activated. By legally forcing the transfer of that deed into his corporate holding company, Marcus had unknowingly assumed immediate legal and financial responsibility for every single penny of that massive government debt. I sat back and stared at the screen, letting the sheer magnitude of their colossal failure wash over me. Marcus had just raised $15 million in aggressive capital from high-profile investors to build a luxury eco-resort featuring an infinity pool, a 5-star restaurant, and high-end spa facilities. He promised his investors a pristine nature retreat. Instead, he had legally tethered their entire $15 million fund to a radioactive mud pit that could not legally support the foundation of a single tool shed. The absolute best part was that he had zero clue. I toggled back to his internal construction schedule. Marcus had the official groundbreaking ceremony scheduled for the upcoming Monday. He had already paid exorbitant non-refundable deposits to heavy machinery contractors, caterers for the press event, and public relations firms to secure news coverage. He was planning to invite the mayor, local politicians, and all of his primary financial backers to watch him put a gold-plated shovel into the dirt. What Marcus failed to realize was that the second his contractors began moving that contaminated soil, he would trigger an automatic massive ecological violation. The Environmental Protection Agency would descend on the property, issue catastrophic federal fines, and freeze all of his corporate assets pending a massive federal investigation. The irony was incredibly sweet. My parents had spent my entire life telling me I was a failure because I chose a boring, methodical career over their flashy, high society lifestyle. They had mocked my attention to detail, yet it was their own careless arrogance and their total inability to read the fine print that had sealed their doom. They were so desperate to steal from their own daughter that they completely bypassed the most basic rules of real estate acquisition, They had literally stolen a ticking time bomb and brought it right into their own home, celebrating their cleverness, while the timer counted down to 0. I closed the property databases and securely wiped my search history from Marcus's servers. I had everything I needed. I had irrefutable proof of his embezzlement. I had the double mortgage documents that would leave my parents entirely homeless, and I had the absolute certainty that his grand real estate project was legally and physically impossible to execute. The core 48 acres of the estate, featuring the beautiful wooden cabin and the pristine shoreline, remained completely untouched, safely locked away behind the impenetrable corporate shield of Phoenix Holdings. I looked at the clock on my computer screen. It was almost 3 in the afternoon. Marcus would be returning from his power lunch soon, strutting down the hallway in his expensive suit, demanding progress reports and acting like the undisputed king of the world. I needed to make sure he felt completely invincible. I needed to feed his massive ego so much that he would completely ignore any minor warning signs. The higher he climbed the ladder of his own delusion, the more devastating the impact would be when I finally kicked it out from under him. I smiled, opened a blank spreadsheet, and began preparing a pristine, perfectly sanitized financial summary just for him. I was going to hand him the map leading straight to his own destruction. The next afternoon, Marcus summoned me to his expansive corner office. I walked in holding a printed stack of sanitized financial summaries I had meticulously crafted. His office was a testament to excess, featuring imported leather furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a massive mahogany desk dominating the room. He sat leaning back with his hands clasped behind his head, projecting the image of a seasoned real estate mogul. I placed the crisp folders on his desk, keeping my expressions submissive and professional. These are the preliminary expense reports and the initial cost projections for the groundbreaking ceremony. I said, my voice carefully modulated to sound obedient. Everything is perfectly balanced. I formatted the summaries specifically for your investor board meeting tomorrow morning. The capital flow looks exceptionally robust. Marcus leaned forward, opening the folder. His eyes skimmed the immaculate spreadsheets. I intentionally highlighted fake asset projections while burying his astronomical consulting fees under layers of plausible construction jargon. He nodded slowly, a predatory grin spreading across his face. He completely bought the illusion. He never asked for supporting documentation. He never requested raw bank statements. His arrogance was so absolute that he blindly trusted a one-page summary simply because it confirmed his own massive delusions of grandeur. "You actually do decent work when properly supervised, Harper," he remarked, not bothering to look up. "These fake numbers are absolutely fantastic. The investors will eat this up. I have a presentation with the lead backers tomorrow, and this is exactly the streamlined data I need to keep them throwing cash at me. Just focus on logging receipts and leave the heavy lifting to the real visionaries." "I will ensure the ledgers remain perfectly organized," I replied, offering a tight, respectful nod. I turned and walked back to my cramped cubicle, feeling a surge of dark satisfaction. I had just handed him a beautifully wrapped grenade, and he was eager to pull the pin in front of millionaires. The week dragged on, and my family continued to relentlessly push their luck. Emboldened by stolen investor money, Chloe began making daily visits to the development firm. She treated the corporate office like her personal country club, parading down the hallways in freshly purchased haute couture outfits, dripping in diamonds, and carrying limited edition handbags bought with misappropriated funds. On Thursday morning, Chloe strutted right up to my tiny workspace. She leaned against the flimsy partition, holding a ridiculously expensive designer shopping bag. She looked down at my sensible work clothes with a mixture of disgust and profound pity. "Harper," she sighed loudly, ensuring junior analysts in neighboring cubicles could hear every word. "You really need to put some effort into your appearance. It is completely embarrassing having my sister walking around my husband's firm looking like a depressed librarian. We are a high-profile family now. You represent our brand." I stopped typing and looked up at her, maintaining a perfectly placid expression. "I am just trying to focus on the bookkeeping, Chloe. The workload is quite heavy." She rolled her eyes dramatically at me. "Since you are just sitting here doing basic data entry, be useful and go fetch me an iced latte from the cafe downstairs. I have an important lunch date with the mayor's wife, and I cannot wait in line. Use your own money. Consider it a tax for letting you work here." She tossed a crumpled $5 bill onto my keyboard, a deliberate insult. In the past, this blatant disrespect would have sparked a massive emotional argument. I would have defended myself, and she would have instantly run crying to our parents, twisting the narrative to make me the villain. But I was no longer the frustrated, unheard daughter fighting for basic respect. I was a sniper patiently adjusting my scope. "Of course, Chloe," I said softly. I stood, took the bill, and walked past her. I went downstairs, bought the overpriced coffee, and brought it directly to her, handing it over with a polite smile. She snatched the cup without a word of thanks and strutted away, giggling with an assistant about my pathetic obedience. I returned to my desk, my smile broadening. Every insult, every petty demand, every public humiliation she inflicted on me was just another nail driven firmly into her own coffin. She treated me like a servant while wearing a handbag that would soon be seized by federal investigators as evidence of grand larceny. Her cruelty only hardened my resolve. I wanted her to feel like she was floating on top of the world, so the gravity of her inevitable fall would shatter her completely. My parents were equally infected by the delusion of impending massive wealth. I subtly fed Marcus inflated projections about the media reach of the groundbreaking ceremony, mentioning that a project of this magnitude deserved attention from national architectural magazines and elite society reporters. Marcus swallowed the bait and relayed the hype directly to Thomas and Victoria. They instantly activated their entire social network. My parents began giving exclusive interviews to high society lifestyle publications, boasting about their real estate acumen and brilliant son-in-law. They posed for glamorous photo shoots in their sprawling mansion, the very mansion they had secretly double-mortgaged to the brink of foreclosure. They bragged openly about transitioning from mere socialites to major commercial developers. They were overextending themselves, alienating peers with unchecked arrogance, ensuring every member of their elite circle would watch them closely on the day of the ceremony. I sat in my dark corner orchestrating their rise to the spotlight with meticulous care. I updated fake spreadsheets, fetched coffees, and absorbed their relentless mockery. I gave them absolutely no reason to suspect the quiet, obedient sister in the back cubicle was systematically arming explosives that would entirely decimate their lives. They thought I was broken. They thought I was tamed. They were completely unaware that the silence of their victim was merely the sound of a trap being set. The trap was set, and my parents were eager to dive headfirst into it. As the groundbreaking ceremony drew nearer, Thomas and Victoria launched a public relations campaign that bordered on absolute hysteria. They hired a boutique marketing firm, paying them an exorbitant retainer, using the very same high-interest loan money that was ticking away toward their inevitable foreclosure. Suddenly, their faces were everywhere. They graced the glossy covers of elite local lifestyle magazines, posed strategically in their manicured gardens, wearing designer clothing they could no longer legitimately afford. The headlines lauded them as visionary real estate pioneers, detailing how the esteemed couple was transitioning from high society fixtures to dominant commercial developers. They completely bought into their own fabricated hype. My mother gave extensive, pretentious interviews detailing how her sharp eye for luxury had guided Marcus in designing the eco-resort. My father boasted to financial reporters about his keen instinct for identifying lucrative land acquisitions, conveniently leaving out the part where he stole the deed from his own daughter. They constructed a glittering, perfect public image, preparing to step into the highest echelon of the city's elite without a single ounce of actual business acumen. Of course, they could not resist using their newfound media platform to take a few public shots at me. In a particularly nauseating feature for a prominent business journal, the interviewer asked my father about his family's involvement in the enterprise. Thomas smiled for the camera and spoke about Chloe and Marcus with glowing, unconditional pride. Then he delivered a thinly veiled insult aimed directly at my career. He stated that true success requires bold risks and an aggressive mindset, lamenting that some people simply lack the vision and ambition to ever leave their safe, monotonous corporate jobs. He chuckled as he told the reporter that a family legacy cannot be built by accountants pushing pencils in the background. My mother chimed in, adding that while they loved all their children, it was a profound relief to finally have a true visionary like Marcus to carry the family name forward. She even managed to sneak in a comment about how career-obsessed women often end up lonely. I read the article during my lunch break, sitting at my cramped desk near the supply closet. I did not feel hurt. I felt a deep, resonant thrill. They were putting their arrogance on permanent public record. The family's collective arrogance reached a suffocating peak in the days immediately leading up to the gala. Chloe behaved as if she were ascending to royalty. She spent her afternoons demanding that Marcus's staff coordinate her wardrobe changes for the event, insisting on a dedicated hair and makeup tent at the construction site. She even ordered a custom crystal-encrusted hard hat for the photo opportunity. She treated the junior executives like her personal assistants, complaining loudly about the catering choices and demanding imported orchids for the floral arrangements. Marcus was equally unbearable. He strutted through the office, making wild promises to his contractors, assuring them that this resort was merely the first phase of a multi-billion-dollar empire. He spent hours practicing his keynote speech, adjusting his posture in the mirror of his corner office, fully convinced he was about to be crowned the new king of the city's real estate market. They were practically vibrating with self-importance. They believed they were untouchable. They had completely forgotten the cardinal rule of high-stakes development. You never invite the entire world to watch you perform a magic trick unless you are absolutely certain the illusion is flawless. I knew that for my ultimate plan to work flawlessly, I needed a massive audience. A small private failure would allow my family to spin the narrative, hide their bankruptcy, and quietly sweep their humiliation under the rug. I needed a spectacular, highly visible detonation. I needed the most influential people in the city standing in the front row when the truth finally dropped. So I took matters into my own hands. Using encrypted email servers and untraceable digital aliases, I began leaking highly tantalizing anonymous tips to the local press. I contacted the sharpest investigative journalists in the real estate sector, framing my messages as insider trading tips. I hinted that Marcus's upcoming groundbreaking would feature an unprecedented industry announcement that would permanently alter the regional market. I sent vague but compelling messages to my parents' fiercest high society rivals, suggesting that the event would reveal a partnership redefining luxury development. I knew exactly which buttons to push to activate their intense social anxiety. Fear of missing out is the strongest motivating factor among the ultra-wealthy, and I played their insecurities like a perfectly tuned instrument. I did not stop with the press and the local socialites. I dug into Marcus's contact lists and sent anonymous, perfectly crafted corporate teasers to his major investors. I implied that the mayor's office was preparing a special commendation for the project at the event, hinting at lucrative government subsidies that would guarantee massive immediate returns on their investments. The bait worked better than I could have possibly imagined. Within 48 hours, the RSVP list for the groundbreaking ceremony absolutely exploded. Elite investors canceled their weekend flights to ensure they were present. High society rivals practically begged the event coordinators for extra VIP passes, desperate to be seen at the party of the year. Even the city's most cynical business reporters cleared their schedules, eager to witness what was being hyped as the most significant commercial real estate launch of the decade. The stage was meticulously set. The massive white tents were erected on the edge of the toxic swamp, and the champagne towers were ordered. I sat in my windowless cubicle watching the confirmation emails flood into Marcus's server. My family had aggressively demanded a spotlight to showcase their stolen empire. I was going to give them a supernova. The morning of the groundbreaking ceremony dawned with brilliant, cloudless perfection. Marcus had spared absolutely no expense in transforming the edge of that toxic marshland into a breathtaking mirage of luxury. Massive white event tents had been erected overnight, anchored securely into the deceptive soil. To hide the unstable, contaminated mud, his contractors had laid down hundreds of feet of elevated mahogany decking, creating a pristine viewing platform that stretched toward the shimmering lake in the distance. A classical string quartet played elegantly, their music carrying over the gentle rustle of the wind. Crystal champagne towers caught the morning sunlight, and servers in crisp white tuxedos circulated through the rapidly growing crowd with trays of beluga caviar and imported truffles. Every single detail screamed unimaginable wealth, and every single invoice for this extravagant theater had been paid using embezzled investor capital. I did not go to the office that morning. Instead, I spent the early hours in the executive suite of a downtown law firm making final preparations with my legal team. While my family bathed in the flashing lights of local press photographers, I was authorizing the final injunctions and reviewing the criminal referral files we were about to deliver. I had arranged for a private car service to bring me to the site precisely 1 hour after the event officially began. I wanted the venue to be at maximum capacity. I wanted every investor, every journalist, and every high society rival to be holding a glass of champagne, utterly captivated by my family's performance before I pulled the curtain down. From the live feed streaming on local news channels, I watched the party reach a fever pitch of arrogance. The press attendance was staggering, entirely validating the anonymous leaks I had meticulously planted throughout the week. Chloe was the absolute center of attention, holding court near the gold-plated ceremonial shovels. She wore a custom silk gown that cost more than a luxury vehicle, but it was the jewelry that truly commanded the camera lenses. She was quite literally dripping in diamonds. A massive glittering necklace rested against her collarbone, and matching chandelier earrings caught the sunlight every time she laughed. I knew the exact routing numbers that had moved investor cash to a Swiss jeweler to pay for those stones. She posed for the cameras with the practiced elegance of a Hollywood celebrity, entirely oblivious to the fact she was parading federal evidence around her neck. Marcus stood a few feet away, surrounded by the lead investors who had funded his $15 million fantasy. He wore a bespoke Italian suit, gesturing animatedly toward the lake as he pointed out where the infinity pool and the five-star restaurant would allegedly be constructed. He shook hands, slapped backs, and grinned with the feral confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. He was promising them returns that defied financial logic, and they were drinking in his every word, blinded by the champagne and the sheer scale of the event. Near the main podium, Thomas and Victoria had managed to corner the city mayor and his wife. My parents looked exactly like the aristocratic developers they had always pretended to be. Victoria laughed politely at something the mayor said, her posture radiating elite superiority. Thomas was gesturing toward the crowd, undoubtedly taking credit for discovering this prime real estate opportunity. They were completely in their element, soaking up the respect and admiration of the city's most powerful figures. They had leveraged their home stolen from their daughter and tied their entire existence to this singular moment. They were standing at the absolute pinnacle of their social climbing careers. As my black town car turned off the main highway and glided down the private access road toward the event, my phone buzzed with a message from my lead attorney, Elaine. The federal authorities have reviewed the dossiers. They are standing by. I locked my phone and slid it into my pocket. The time for hiding in cramped cubicles and fetching coffee was officially over. The town car pulled up to the security checkpoint at the edge of the mahogany decking. The valet attendees, expecting another wealthy investor, rushed forward to open the door. I did not step out wearing my usual modest cardigans or sensible flats. I had spent a portion of my legitimate hard-earned salary on an outfit designed specifically for a corporate execution. I stepped out of the vehicle wearing a razor-sharp custom-tailored charcoal power suit that fit like armor. My hair was sleek and perfectly styled, and I wore a pair of dark, intimidating sunglasses. I looked exactly like what I was, a high-level forensic investigator arriving to dismantle a criminal enterprise. I was not alone. The doors on the opposite side of the car opened, and two formidable corporate attorneys stepped out to flank me. Elaine, a ruthless litigator known for tearing apart fraudulent executives in federal court, stood to my right, holding a heavy leather briefcase. David, a senior compliance lawyer who specialized in environmental law, stood to my left. Together we formed an impenetrable wall of legal authority. We bypassed the valet stand and began walking down the elevated wooden pathway toward the main event tents. The heavy, rhythmic sound of our footsteps against the mahogany decking caused a few heads to turn in our direction. A local reporter, noticing the severe contrast between our corporate attire and the festive gala wear of the other guests, signaled his cameraman to start recording. A ripple of confusion began to spread through the perimeter of the crowd as we marched past the champagne towers and the string quartet. I kept my eyes fixed squarely on the main podium. I did not look at the catering displays. I did not acknowledge the confused murmurs of the investors as we cut a direct path through their ranks. I was a heat-seeking missile locked onto my targets. The crowd naturally parted for us, sensing the heavy, undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The celebratory energy of the gala began to evaporate, replaced by a tense electric curiosity. We were 50 feet away when Chloe finally noticed the commotion. Her laughter abruptly died in her throat. She lowered her champagne glass, her eyes widening in absolute shock as she recognized the woman in the charcoal suit marching relentlessly toward her stolen empire. Chloe's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. The massive diamond necklace resting heavily against her collarbone suddenly seemed to weigh her down as she gripped her crystal champagne flute tightly enough to risk shattering the delicate glass into 100 pieces. Her perfectly manicured nails dug fiercely into her palms. Her panicked gaze darted erratically from my perfectly tailored charcoal suit to the two imposing, unsmiling attorneys walking in flawless lockstep beside me. Marcus, who had been in the middle of pitching a fabricated, highly inflated return on investment to a group of skeptical international bankers, noticed his wife's sudden, inexplicable paralysis. He paused, mid-sentence, his million-dollar camera-ready smile faltering as he followed her terrified line of sight. When his eyes finally locked onto mine, the charming diplomatic facade he had so carefully maintained all morning completely dissolved into ash. Pure, unadulterated fury contorted his handsome features. I was the mousy, broken sister-in-law he had relegated to a windowless cubicle next to a supply closet just yesterday. I was the woman he had tried to humiliate into total submission. Now I was a looming, undeniable threat, crashing his multi-million-dollar coronation. He muttered a hasty, disjointed excuse to the bewildered bankers and marched toward me. His strides were long, heavy, and aggressive, determined to extinguish this unexpected spark before it ignited his fragile empire. Marcus raised his right hand and snapped his fingers sharply. Immediately, 4 massive private security guards broke away from the perimeter of the VIP viewing area. They wore matching black suits and discreet earpieces hired specifically to keep the aggressive local press at bay and maintain the illusion of absolute exclusivity for the wealthy guests. Now they were being deployed as his personal muscle to throw me out into the dirt. Marcus intercepted me near the very center of the mahogany deck, planting his feet firmly and standing squarely in my path. He puffed out his chest, puffing himself up to his full height, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me into backing down. "What exactly do you think you are doing, Harper?" he hissed, his voice pitched dangerously low to avoid drawing the attention of the nearby journalists who were already sniffing around the catering tables. "You are making an absolute fool of yourself. Get out of here right now before I have you arrested for trespassing. This is a private, multi-million-dollar corporate event, not a family therapy session." I did not break my stride until I was standing mere inches from him. I did not flinch, and I did not lower my gaze. I looked up at him with the cold clinical detachment of a scientist examining a bug under a microscope. "I am here to do exactly what you hired me to do, Marcus," I replied smoothly. "I am here to audit the books." Marcus's face flushed a deep, angry red. He turned to the lead security guard, a burly man who had just rushed to his side. "Get this embarrassing, unstable woman off my property immediately," Marcus barked, pointing a shaking finger toward the parking lot. "Drag her out by her hair if you have to. I do not care. Just remove her." The head of security stepped forward, reaching out a thick hand to grab my shoulder. He never made contact. Elaine stepped smoothly between us, moving with the practiced efficiency of a woman who destroyed corporate giants before breakfast. She did not raise her voice, but her tone was sharp enough to cut glass. I highly recommend you keep your hands to yourself unless you want to face immediate federal assault charges, she stated. The security guard hesitated, his hand hovering uncertainly in midair. Elaine calmly unclasped her heavy leather briefcase. She retrieved a thick stack of legal documents bound by a bright blue ribbon and stamped with the official seal of the state's highest court. She handed the top document directly to the head of security, bypassing Marcus entirely. That is a federal injunction, Elaine explained, her voice carrying clearly over the gentle morning breeze blowing off the lake. It grants my client Harper full legal authorization to be on these premises to protect her financial interests. It also carries an immediate restraining mandate. If you or any of your men attempt to physically remove her, you will be in direct violation of a federal court order. The head of security took the paper. His eyes quickly scanned the dense legal text, focusing immediately on the bold, undeniable signatures of the district judge and the glaring red seal at the bottom of the page. The color rapidly drained from his face. He was paid to bounce unruly guests and protect celebrities, not to violate federal injunctions and risk a massive prison sentence for a client he barely knew. He slowly lowered his hands and took a deliberate step backward, creating a wide berth around me. "What are you doing?" Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with panicked rage. "I pay your salary. I gave you a direct order to throw her out." The security chief shook his head, refusing to look Marcus in the eye. "I cannot touch her, sir. The paperwork is ironclad. We have to stand down." Marcus stared at his security team in absolute disbelief. The illusion of his total control was shattering in real time. The commotion had finally drawn the attention of the string quartet playing near the towering champagne displays. Seeing the aggressive standoff and the intimidating presence of my legal team, the lead cellist abruptly stopped playing. The violinists faltered a second later. The elegant classical music that had masked the underlying tension suddenly died, leaving a heavy, deafening silence hanging over the entire gala. The sudden absence of music was like a gunshot. Hundreds of wealthy investors, local politicians, and aggressive journalists instantly turned their undivided attention toward the center of the deck. Whispers erupted through the high society crowd like wildfire. Camera flashes began to pop in the background. The press, sensing blood in the water, instinctively raised their recording equipment. I stepped around Marcus, treating him as nothing more than a minor obstacle in my path. I resumed my steady, deliberate march toward the main stage. The elite crowd parted for me like the Red Sea, stepping aside to let my attorneys and me pass. No one dared to block my way or speak a single word. The tension in the ambient air reached a boiling point, thick and completely suffocating. As I walked down the makeshift aisle, I locked eyes with Thomas and Victoria. They were standing frozen next to the mayor of the city. Their smug, aristocratic smiles had entirely melted away, replaced by the naked, horrifying realization that their invisible, boring daughter was about to tear their glittering world completely to shreds. I reached the wooden steps of the main stage, my heels echoing sharply, and began my final ascent. I crested the final wooden step of the stage, my heels planting firmly on the polished platform. Thomas stood rigidly behind the main podium. His fingers were wrapped tightly around the microphone stand, his knuckles white with tension. He had been preparing to deliver a grand speech about family legacy, about vision and elite prosperity. Now his mouth hung slightly open, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. He looked like a man watching a tidal wave approach the shore, knowing he was hopelessly rooted to the sand. I stepped right into his personal space, refusing to yield a single inch. Our eyes locked. He tried to muster the authoritative, demanding glare he had used to control me since I was a child, but the absolute certainty radiating from my posture crushed his attempt instantly. I reached out and wrapped my hand around the microphone. I did not yank it or fight him for it. I simply applied a steady, unyielding pressure. For a fraction of a second, his grip tightened. Then, recognizing the inescapable reality of his own public defeat, his fingers went completely slack. I pulled the microphone smoothly from his grasp. "Thank you, Thomas," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, carrying only to his ears. "I will take it from here." He stumbled backward, retreating into the shadows of the extravagant floral arrangements, entirely neutralized by his own cowardice. Before I could even lift the microphone to my lips, a shrill, piercing shriek shattered the silence. Chloe had finally broken through her paralysis. She charged toward the wooden stairs of the stage, her heavy silk designer gown dragging awkwardly across the mahogany decking. The massive diamond necklace bounced violently against her chest as she sprinted upward. "Get off this stage right now," she screamed, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "You are ruining my day. You are ruining everything. Get out!" She lunged forward, extending her arms, her manicured claws aiming directly for the microphone in my hand. She was fully prepared to tackle me to the ground in front of the city elite to protect her stolen throne. She never even made it within arm's reach. David and Elaine moved with the synchronized, devastating precision of a highly trained security detail. David stepped sharply to the right, using his broad shoulders to physically obstruct her path. Elaine moved simultaneously to the left, raising her heavy leather briefcase like a shield. Chloe collided hard with David's unyielding frame. The impact knocked the breath out of her lungs and sent her stumbling backward. She flailed wildly, her custom heels catching on the hem of her expensive gown. She fell hard onto the wooden deck of the stage, scraping her knees and tearing the delicate silk of her dress. "Do not take another step toward my client," Elaine commanded, her voice ringing out with icy legal authority. "If you attempt to assault her again, I will have the police arrest you for battery before you can even stand up." Chloe scrambled to her knees, gasping for air, her face flushed dark crimson with unprecedented public humiliation. She looked out at the audience, realizing that dozens of journalists were actively photographing her pathetic, sprawling tantrum on the floor. She shrank back, defeated and trembling, crawling away from the podium to cower near Thomas in the background. With the physical threat completely neutralized, I stepped up to the center of the podium. I adjusted the microphone stand, pulling it down slightly to meet my height. I took a slow, deliberate breath and looked out at the massive sea of faces gathered before me. The visual impact of the crowd was staggering. In the front rows sat the lead investors, wealthy titans of industry wearing sharp suits, their faces a mixture of deep confusion and mounting anxiety. Behind them stood the city mayor, whispering frantically to his aides, sensing a political disaster unfolding in real time. And surrounding them all was the press. The camera lenses were focused squarely on me. The red recording lights of the television news crews blinked steadily. The absolute silence of the crowd was deafening. They had come here today expecting a boring, predictable corporate celebration, a standard exchange of wealthy pleasantries and empty real estate promises. Instead, they were witnessing the hostile takeover of a multi-million-dollar event. They were completely captivated, hanging on every single second, waiting for the woman in the charcoal suit to explain why she had just usurped the city's most anticipated corporate gala. I let the silence stretch for a few more moments to ensure total dominance over the venue. I leaned into the microphone. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," I began. My voice boomed clearly through the massive state-of-the-art sound system Marcus had rented with embezzled funds. The sound rolled across the pristine mahogany decking and echoed off the surface of the lake. I did not speak with anger. I did not raise my voice or let any emotion crack my professional facade. My tone was clinical, precise, and utterly devastating. It was the voice of a forensic auditor delivering the final fatal verdict to a room full of compromised targets. "My name is Harper," I continued, letting my gaze sweep slowly across the front row of wealthy financial backers. "I am a senior forensic investigator specializing in corporate embezzlement and large-scale financial fraud. I know many of you traveled great distances to be here today. You came to celebrate the groundbreaking of a luxury eco-resort. You came to see the physical manifestation of the $15 million in capital you recently injected into this development firm. I paused, turning my head to look directly down at Marcus, who was standing paralyzed at the base of the stage. He was sweating profusely, his face drained of all color, finally understanding the catastrophic magnitude of his mistake. I offered him a polite, chilling smile. "I want to take a moment to publicly thank my brother-in-law, Marcus," I said, my voice echoing across the water. "Tracking down international wire transfers, locating offshore shell companies, and securing the financial ledgers of a fragmented corporate entity can take months of grueling, isolated work. It is often a tedious process involving dozens of subpoenas and endless court hearings just to get the relevant parties into a single room. But Marcus has been incredibly accommodating. By inviting every primary investor, every major creditor, and every relevant member of the local press to this exact location, he has made my job exceptionally efficient. He has gathered all the victims and all the witnesses in one convenient place for the final audit." I raised my left hand and gave a sharp, definitive nod to David and Elaine. Moving with the synchronized efficiency of a military unit, my two attorneys stepped down from the wooden platform and approached the front row. They unclasped their heavy leather briefcases and began distributing thick, professionally bound dossiers directly into the hands of the lead investors. The men in the expensive suits took the folders, hesitantly exchanging nervous glances. The journalists in the press pit instantly recognized the shift in the atmosphere. Camera shutters clicked frantically, zooming in on the bold, red lettering printed across the top of each dossier. The label read, "Certified Forensic Audit and Property Title Review." "Please open the folders to the first page," I instructed, my voice ringing out with absolute authority. "You will find the official county deed and the corresponding surveyor maps for the land we are currently standing on. Marcus sold you a grand vision today. He pitched a 50-acre luxury eco-resort featuring pristine lakefront access, an infinity pool, and a 5-star restaurant. He took $15 million of your capital based on the promise that he held the exclusive development rights to this entire estate." I watched as the lead investor, an older man with silver hair who had previously been shaking Marcus's hand, flipped open the heavy cover of his dossier. His eyes darted across the highlighted legal text, his brow furrowed in deep confusion, which rapidly mutated into dawning horror. "Look closely at the highlighted parcel number on the deed Marcus transferred to his holding company." I continued, pacing slowly across the center of the stage. "You will see that Marcus did not acquire 50 acres of prime real estate. He acquired parcel 409. That is a microscopic 2-acre strip of land located on the extreme eastern edge of the property boundary. It is the exact patch of dirt currently supporting this temporary wooden deck and these rented event tents." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a rising tide of panicked whispers. Marcus stood completely paralyzed at the base of the stairs, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked like a man standing on a landmine, absolutely terrified to lift his foot. "You might be wondering who owns the other 48 acres, I said, allowing a cold smile to touch my lips. 13 years ago, anticipating that my own family might one day attempt a hostile takeover of my inheritance, I established an irrevocable blind trust. That trust is called Phoenix Holdings. It is a completely shielded, impenetrable corporate entity. Phoenix Holdings holds the absolute, uncontestable legal title to the core 48 acres of this estate. It owns the shoreline. It owns the deep water access. It owns the forested trails and the existing structures. Phoenix Holdings answers exclusively to me, and I have absolutely no intention of ever selling a single blade of grass to a fraudulent developer." The silver-haired investor slammed his dossier shut and glared with lethal intent at Marcus. Other financiers in the front row began frantically flipping through the pages, their faces turning pale as the reality of their catastrophic investment set in. They had poured $15 million into a project that had zero legal right to expand past the footprint of a temporary party tent. "But the deception does not stop at a simple boundary dispute," I announced, raising my voice to cut through the escalating chaos. I directed their attention back to the stage. I strongly encourage you to turn to page 2 of your dossiers. There you will find the official environmental assessment reports issued by the State Environmental Protection Agency. I paused, letting the heavy weight of the federal agency name settle over the crowd. In real estate development, there is no word more terrifying than an environmental violation. Parcel 409 is not just a tiny, useless sliver of land, I explained with surgical precision. Decades ago, this specific 2-acre strip was used as an illegal dumping ground for a commercial chemical manufacturer. The soil directly beneath this expensive mahogany decking is catastrophically contaminated with lead arsenic and hazardous industrial runoff. The Environmental Protection Agency placed a permanent, non-negotiable freeze on this land over 20 years ago. It is strictly zoned out of any commercial or residential development forever. You cannot build a luxury spa here. You cannot legally dig a foundation for a public restroom here. Marcus took your millions and bought a radioactive mud pit. The crowd erupted. A prominent real estate backer in the second row actually shouted a curse, dropping his champagne glass. It shattered against the wooden deck, the sharp sound totally lost in the roar of furious voices. The journalists pressed forward against the velvet ropes, shoving their microphones toward the stage, desperate to capture every single word of the corporate slaughter. I raised my hand again, demanding silence. The crowd, desperate for the full extent of the damage, immediately quieted down. The total silence was far more terrifying than the shouting. If Marcus had simply hired an independent surveyor, he would have known the boundaries, I said, looking directly down at my brother-in-law. If he had performed a basic environmental audit, he would have known the soil was toxic. But Marcus was greedy, and my parents were desperate for a payout. They rushed a fraudulent deed transfer, using an obsolete medical guardianship loophole, completely bypassing standard legal due diligence. And because of their reckless arrogance, they triggered a devastating financial trap. I leaned closer to the microphone, delivering the final fatal blow to Marcus's real estate ambitions. Please refer to the final document in that section, I instructed the pale investors. When Marcus transferred the deed of parcel 409 into his corporate holding company, with the stated intent to break ground, he automatically activated the dormant environmental remediation debts attached to the land. As of this morning, Marcus's development firm is legally and entirely responsible for over $4 million in back taxes and federal cleanup fines. He does not just own a worthless piece of toxic dirt. He owes the government $4 million before a single shovel can even touch the ground. The explosion of outrage from the investor section was instantaneous and deafening. Men in expensive suits abandoned all pretense of high society decorum. They surged toward Marcus, their faces contorted in pure, unadulterated rage, demanding answers, demanding their money, and demanding his immediate resignation. Marcus stumbled backward, throwing his hands up in a futile attempt to defend himself against the mob of furious billionaires. The grand illusion of his unrivaled real estate empire was completely and utterly dead. The grand illusion of his unrivaled real estate empire was completely and utterly dead. I watched the chaos unfold from the elevated podium with absolute clinical detachment. The silver-haired lead investor had grabbed Marcus by the lapels of his custom Italian suit, his face purple with rage, shouting demands for an immediate refund. The security guards, having already been neutralized by the federal injunction, stood frozen on the perimeter, completely unwilling to intervene in a dispute between angry billionaires. The journalists were having a field day, their camera shutters firing rapidly, capturing every second of Marcus's public humiliation. But I was not finished. A forensic audit is never truly complete until every stolen cent is dragged out into the harsh light of day. I raised the microphone to my lips and let a sharp, piercing whistle of feedback echo through the sound system. The high-pitched noise instantly sliced through the shouting. The investors froze in their tracks, turning their furious faces back toward the stage. Please return to your seats, I instructed, my voice cutting through the crisp morning air with glacial authority. The environmental disaster you just discovered is merely the foundation of Marcus's sheer incompetence. If you want to know what happened to the actual cash you wired into his corporate escrow account, I strongly suggest you turn to Section 3 of your dossiers. The investors practically scrambled to comply. They ripped past the environmental reports, their hands shaking with a violent mixture of terror and fury. Marcus tried to make a break for the exit, but David, my environmental lawyer, casually stepped directly into his path, blocking the only clear escape route. Marcus was trapped in the center of the viewing deck, entirely surrounded by the powerful people he had just brazenly defrauded. When you invest $15 million into a commercial development, you expect that capital to be allocated toward architectural planning, heavy machinery, and construction materials. I began pacing slowly across the wooden stage. You expect your money to build the solid foundation of a world-class luxury resort. But Marcus had a completely different vision for your funds. He decided that building a resort was far too much work. He found it much easier to simply build a fraudulent lifestyle. I pointed to the large presentation screen behind me. A clicker in my hand brought up a massive high-definition projection of a corporate ledger. Look closely at the screen, I commanded. You will see a series of highly suspicious outbound wire transfers directed to a limited liability company called Apex Consulting Solutions. Marcus logged these transfers as critical architectural design fees. In reality, Apex Consulting Solutions is a dummy corporation registered to an empty mailbox in Delaware. I traced those exact funds directly from your escrow account through the shell company and straight into the checking account of an exclusive European auto dealership. I clicked to the next slide. A crisp photograph of a custom matte black Lamborghini filled the massive screen right alongside a wire transfer receipt for $350,000. Marcus did not buy construction equipment, I announced, staring directly down at him. He bought himself a supercar. He categorized a $350,000 Lamborghini as a site transport vehicle in his internal ledgers. He used your investment capital to play the role of a wealthy tycoon while standing on a toxic swamp. A collective gasp rippled through the front rows. The silver-haired investor slammed his fist heavily against the armrest of his chair, his face contorted in absolute rage. But the financial bloodbath was far from over. I clicked the remote again. The screen shifted to display a series of invoices billed to a company named Horizon Design Group. Marcus did not just treat himself. I continued, my voice echoing across the pristine lake. He is a family man, after all. He set up Horizon Design Group to funnel massive payouts under the guise of environmental impact studies. But the registered agent for Horizon Design Group is not a scientist or a surveyor. It is my younger sister, Chloe. Every single eye in the audience instantly snapped toward Chloe. She was still cowering near the floral arrangements, her torn silk designer gown covered in dust from her earlier fall. She shrank back against the stage skirting, trying desperately to make herself invisible, but the harsh spotlight was inescapable. My parents. Thomas and Victoria stared at her in total shock, realizing their golden child was deeply complicit in the theft. Just last Tuesday, Marcus approved a $75,000 consulting fee to Chloe's shell company. I stated my words, falling like heavy stones into the silent crowd. That money did not pay for soil testing. It paid for the limited edition designer handbag currently sitting on her chair. It paid for the custom Cartier bracelets on her wrists. And most notably, it paid for the massive diamond necklace currently resting against her collarbone. The cameras pivoted violently toward Chloe. The journalists zoomed in on the glittering diamonds she had so proudly flaunted just an hour ago. She raised trembling hands to her neck, trying to hide the jewelry, but the damage was already done. She was publicly wearing stolen evidence. "You are literally wearing my money!" One of the female investors shrieked from the third row, pointing an accusing finger directly at Chloe. "You are parading around in diamonds bought with my retirement fund. Take it off right now." Chloe burst into genuine hysterical tears. She fumbled blindly with the clasp of the necklace, her manicured nails catching on the heavy metal, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her public exposure. I advanced the presentation to the final, most devastating slide. It showed a flight manifest and a staggering invoice for $200,000. If you are wondering why your quarterly progress reports were delayed last month, I said, driving the final nail into their coffin, it is because Marcus and Chloe were unavailable. They routed $200,000 of your capital to a private aviation firm, labeling the expense as regional site surveying. They did not survey the lakefront. They chartered a private jet for a spontaneous luxury vacation to Bora Bora. They drank champagne on a tropical beach while your money burned. I lowered the microphone slightly, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second before delivering the killing blow. In total, Marcus has siphoned over $4 million of your $15 million investment pool in less than 6 months. The rest of the capital is legally frozen due to the severe environmental violations attached to this land. Your money is not just tied up in a bad real estate deal, it is gone. It was squandered on sports cars, private jets, and stolen diamonds. The crowd did not just gasp this time. They completely lost their minds. The investors erupted in a wave of absolute unbridled fury. Chairs were knocked over as furious billionaires surged toward the front of the viewing deck. The polite high society gala had officially transformed into an angry mob. They hurled insults and threats at Marcus, demanding his immediate arrest. The journalists shoved their way to the front, eager to capture every second of the elite financial slaughter. Marcus was entirely surrounded, physically backed against the railing of the mahogany deck. He raised his hands desperately, trying to formulate an excuse, trying to spin a narrative that could save him, but his silver tongue had completely failed. He was a fraud stripped bare in front of the entire world, and there was absolutely nowhere left for him to hide. From the chaotic fray near the floral arrangements, my father finally broke his terrified paralysis. Desperation is a powerful motivator, and Thomas was watching his entire social and financial existence evaporate into thin air. He scrambled across the wooden platform, knocking over a crystal champagne flute in his frantic rush toward a secondary audio console set up for the string quartet. He snatched a spare microphone from its stand, his hands trembling so violently that the microphone bumped against his teeth as he brought it to his mouth. "Please, everybody, please listen to me," Thomas shouted over the roar of the furious crowd. The speakers shrieked with a sudden burst of audio feedback, forcing several investors in the front row to cover their ears. He gripped the microphone with both hands, adopting the deeply patronizing, falsely sympathetic tone he had used to dismiss and control me my entire life. "You must calm down," Thomas pleaded, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "You cannot believe a single word this woman is saying. Harper is my daughter, and it breaks my heart to say this publicly, but she is deeply, profoundly unwell. She has a long documented history of severe mental instability. She suffered a traumatic head injury years ago and has never been the same since that accident. She is currently experiencing a massive psychological breakdown. These documents are nothing but paranoid, fabricated delusions of a very sick woman who has always been pathologically jealous of her sister's happiness and her brother-in-law's success." He looked out at the angry mob, trying desperately to weave his familiar web of gaslighting. "Do not let her ruin this magnificent project," he begged, his voice dripping with fabricated emotion. "Marcus is a visionary. My wife and I have personally backed this project with our own capital because we believe in it. We are handling Harper's mental health crisis internally. Just give us a moment to escort her to a secure medical facility, and we can resume this beautiful celebration." The crowd hesitated for a fraction of a second. The sheer conviction of a father publicly declaring his daughter insane was jarring enough to momentarily stall their outrage. Victoria instantly seized the opportunity, stepping up beside Thomas and placing a theatrical, comforting hand on his shoulder while dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. I did not interrupt him. I stood completely still at the main podium, letting his desperate, echoing lies wash over the venue. I wanted every single journalist, every investor, and every high society rival to hear exactly how my parents operated. I wanted his absolute refusal to take accountability permanently recorded by the dozen news cameras pointed at his face. When he finally ran out of breath, panting heavily into the microphone, I offered him a cold, unforgiving smile. "Are you quite finished, Thomas?" I asked calmly, my voice projecting effortlessly over the crowd. I raised my left hand and pressed the button on my presentation remote. The massive digital screen behind me flickered. The damning images of Chloe's diamonds and Marcus's sports car vanished. In their place appeared a massive high-definition scan of a legal property transfer document. It was the exact deed of sale they had used to secretly siphon the toxic parcel of land out of my name and into Marcus's corporate holding company. If I am suffering from a mental breakdown, I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy tension, then I am certainly the most legally proficient lunatic in the state. I direct your attention to the main screen. This is the deed of sale transferring ownership of Parcel 409. I clicked the remote again. The screen zoomed in aggressively on the bottom of the document, magnifying the signature line until it was 10 feet tall. This document is the foundation of Marcus's entire $15 million enterprise, I explained, walking slowly toward the edge of the stage to maintain absolute command of the room. My parents claim they utilized a dormant medical guardianship proxy from 13 years ago to legally authorize this transfer. They claim they acted as my legal conservators, but there is a massive fatal flaw in their brilliant real estate maneuver. I clicked the remote one more time. A second document appeared right next to the deed. It was my grandfather's original authenticated will and testament establishing the Phoenix Holdings Blind Trust. I highlighted my grandfather's signature at the bottom of the page in bright red. Look at the signature on the left, I commanded, pointing to the forged deed. Now look at the authenticated signature on the right. When my parents and Marcus rushed to finalize this fraudulent sale, they encountered a minor legal roadblock. The county clerk required the original property owner's signature to authorize the transfer of the specific decoy parcel they were attempting to steal. Since my grandfather had been the original purchaser of the entire estate, his authorization was legally mandated to clear the title transfer to my parents' guardianship. The silence in the venue was absolute. Even Thomas and Victoria had stopped breathing, their eyes glued to the massive screen. My grandfather passed away over a decade ago, I stated, my words ringing out with lethal clarity. Yet magically, his signature appeared on a property transfer document dated exactly 3 weeks ago. My parents and my brother-in-law did not just use a shady guardianship loophole to sell my land. When they realized they needed my deceased grandfather's authorization to clear the title, they simply fabricated it. I turned to look directly into my father's terrified eyes. The smug, patronizing facade had been utterly obliterated. He was visibly shaking the microphone, slipping from his sweaty grip and clattering loudly onto the wooden deck. Forging a deceased man's signature to bypass a legal title transfer is not a creative business strategy. I informed him, my voice devoid of any sympathy. Manipulating a dormant medical proxy to steal property from your own daughter is not a minor administrative error. In this state, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, elder abuse, grand larceny, and the deliberate forgery of official legal documents all combine into a very specific charge. It is a Class A felony. Victoria let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She gripped the edge of the podium, her knees physically buckling under the crushing weight of the legal reality I had just dropped on her head. Marcus backed further against the wooden railing, looking wildly around the venue, like a trapped animal, realizing the cage door had permanently locked shut. You did not build a family legacy. I continued, my gaze sweeping over my mother, my father, and my sister, who was still weeping on the floor. You built a criminal conspiracy. You staked your entire financial future, your social standing, and your freedom on a forged piece of paper. And you did it all because you thought I was too weak and too stupid to ever catch you. The investors did not need any more convincing. The undeniable proof of a forged signature on a multi-million-dollar land acquisition was the ultimate death blow. The lead investor pulled out his cell phone, aggressively dialing his corporate legal team to initiate immediate asset freezes. The journalists were practically shouting into their microphones, broadcasting the unprecedented implosion of a prominent local family live on daytime television. Then, cutting through the frantic shouts of the investors and the relentless clicking of camera shutters, a new sound emerged. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail echoing off the surface of the lake. Within seconds, the sound grew louder, multiplying and amplifying as it tore down the private access road. I stood perfectly still on the elevated stage, watching the color drain completely from Marcus's face. The wail of police sirens pierced the crisp morning air, growing deafeningly loud as a fleet of black and white squad cars tore into the valet parking lot, their red and blue lights flashing violently against the pristine white event tents. The heavy thud of car doors slamming shut echoed across the lake as a dozen uniformed officers and two plainclothes detectives stepped out onto the gravel driveway. The flashing red and blue lights painted the horrified faces of the gala attendees in chaotic strobing colors. This was no longer a high society dispute over breached contracts. This was a coordinated federal raid. The reality of the approaching police presence acted as a massive catalyst, instantly detonating whatever fragile restraints remained, holding my family together. The carefully constructed facade of aristocratic loyalty completely evaporated, replaced by the ugly feral instinct of sheer self-preservation. Marcus was the first to completely break. The smooth, confident real estate tycoon vanished, leaving behind a terrified, desperate fraudster cornered by his own hubris. He spun around, his eyes wild and bloodshot, and lunged toward my father. Marcus grabbed Thomas by the lapels of his expensive custom suit, shoving him backward against the heavy wooden podium. The microphone stand tipped over, crashing loudly onto the mahogany deck, but neither man noticed the sharp sound. "You told me the deed was clean," Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. His polished demeanor was entirely gone. Saliva flew from his lips as he shook his father-in-law violently. "You promised me you had full legal authority to transfer that parcel. You said the guardianship papers were airtight. You explicitly assured me there would be absolutely zero blowback from your lunatic daughter. You set me up. You used me to launder your own toxic debt." Thomas shoved Marcus away with startling aggression, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He raised his hands desperately, trying to physically distance himself from the sinking ship he had enthusiastically boarded just a few weeks prior. "Do not! You dare put this on me!" Thomas roared back, his aristocratic composure shattering into a million pathetic pieces. "You are the so-called developer. You are the one who supposedly performs due diligence. You took the deed and ran with it because you were desperate for capital. You were completely broke, Marcus. You needed a flashy project to cover up the fact that your entire firm was running on fumes. I gave you the land. What you did with the investor money is entirely your own criminal problem." Victoria rushed forward, grabbing her husband's arm in a futile attempt to silence him. "Thomas, stop talking right now," she hissed, looking frantically at the approaching police officers and the surrounding swarm of journalists recording their every word. "You are admitting everything on camera. Shut your mouth right now before you implicate us further." But the dam had completely burst. The loyalty they had so proudly boasted about in glossy lifestyle magazines was nothing but a fragile convenience binding them together only as long as the money flowed. The second the threat of federal prison materialized, they instantly turned into a pack of starving wolves, tearing at each other's throats to escape the snare. Chloe, still kneeling on the dusty mahogany deck in her torn designer gown, realized with horrifying clarity that her husband was about to be handcuffed on national television. She recognized that the luxurious lifestyle she believed was her birthright was collapsing into a mountain of federal indictments. In a spectacular display of absolute cowardice, she immediately decided to sacrifice the man she had sworn to love. She scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking violently as she clawed at her own neck. She unclasped the massive diamond necklace, practically ripping it from her skin, and threw the multi-million-dollar piece of stolen jewelry directly at Marcus's chest. "I had nothing to do with this!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly over the chaotic din of the crowd. She backed away from him, holding her hands up in a theatrical display of profound victimhood. "I did not know the money was stolen. Marcus handled all the finances. He told me the consulting fees were a legitimate tax strategy. He told me the business was thriving. I am completely innocent. I am just a wife who trusted her husband. He manipulated me." Marcus stared at the diamonds lying abandoned on the wooden deck, then slowly raised his eyes to look at his wife. The sheer betrayal registering on his face was almost Shakespearean. He let out a harsh barking laugh that bordered on pure madness. "You did not know," Marcus yelled, taking an aggressive step toward Chloe. "You did not know the money was stolen when you demanded a private jet to Bora Bora just last month. You did not ask any questions when you billed my holding company $75,000 for non-existent environmental consulting just so you could buy out the entire spring collection at Cartier. You begged me to drain that escrow account. You threatened to leave me if I did not maintain your ridiculous standard of living. You are just as guilty as I am, Chloe. Do not pretend you are some naive victim. You happily drank the champagne while we burned their money. Chloe let out a dramatic sobbing wail, turning toward the crowd as if searching for a sympathetic face. There was absolutely no sympathy to be found. The investors had officially breached the velvet ropes separating the VIP section from the main stage. The polite high society boundary was completely obliterated. Dozens of furious, powerful billionaires swarmed the wooden platform, their faces contorted in violent rage. They entirely enclosed Marcus Thomas and Victoria in a tightening circle of hostility. A prominent hedge fund manager from the second row grabbed the front of Marcus's shirt, pulling him aggressively forward. "Where is my money, you absolute fraud?" the investor demanded, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "You better have a wire transfer queued up right now, or I will personally ensure you never see the outside of a federal penitentiary." Other investors joined the chorus of aggressive demands, shouting over each other, completely drowning out my family's pathetic overlapping excuses. "Give us the funds back. I want my capital returned immediately. You are a dead man in this industry." The cacophony of threats and furious demands created an impenetrable wall of sound. The investors were not just angry about losing capital. They were furious at the deep public humiliation of being conned by a group of amateur, desperate social climbers. I stood a few feet away, securely flanked by David and Elaine, watching the complete and utter devastation of the people who had spent my entire life trying to break me. My parents had built their entire identity on the illusion of superiority and control. Now they were cowering in the center of an angry mob, their reputations permanently destroyed, their financial future completely eradicated, and their freedom hanging by a thread. The police officers finally reached the base of the stage, shouting commands to clear the area, their heavy boots pounding against the wooden planks. The absolute destruction I had orchestrated was executing itself flawlessly, and I did not have to lift another finger. The sweet taste of justice filled the crisp morning air, far more intoxicating than any champagne. The heavy boots of the police officers thundered against the mahogany decking, their authoritative presence slicing through the chaotic mob of enraged investors. A grizzled police captain, flanked by two detectives in sharp suits, shoved his way to the center of the platform. He demanded immediate silence, his voice booming, with the kind of unquestionable authority that only a federal badge can command. The wealthy financiers, realizing that formal criminal proceedings were officially initiating right in front of them, reluctantly took a collective step back, forming a tight, hostile perimeter around my completely cornered brother-in-law. Marcus looked absolutely terrified. The charismatic, untouchable real estate tycoon had completely vanished, replaced by a sweating, hyperventilating fraudster whose meticulously constructed empire had just violently imploded. The captain approached him, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He did not ask for a polite explanation. He did not invite Marcus to a quiet room for a gentlemanly discussion. He informed Marcus loudly and publicly that he was being detained under suspicion of grand larceny, wire fraud, and the forgery of official real estate documents. Marcus frantically tried to backpedal, stammering out a barrage of pathetic excuses. He pointed wildly at Chloe, who was still weeping on the floor, and then aimed his shaking finger directly at my parents. He shrieked that he was merely the frontman, that Thomas and Victoria were the actual masterminds who provided the forged deed, and assured him the environmental restrictions had been cleared. The detectives did not care. My attorney Elaine calmly stepped forward and handed the captain a condensed version of the explosive financial dossier I had compiled. She informed the officers that my legal team had already submitted the primary evidence directly to the district attorney's office earlier this morning. The captain nodded, firmly gripped Marcus by the bicep, and read him his rights as the cameras continued to aggressively flash. Watching Marcus being physically subdued and humiliated was deeply satisfying, but the true reckoning was still waiting for me just a few feet away. As the officers dragged Marcus toward the edge of the stage, my parents finally broke out of their paralyzed state of horror. Thomas and Victoria had just witnessed their golden goose get slaughtered, and with him went their entire future. The sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from them was palpable. They realized that the police would inevitably trace the forged signatures straight back to them. They realized the investors would ruthlessly sue them into oblivion. But most importantly, they realized that the aggressive hard money lenders holding the massive second mortgage on their mansion were going to come to collect their debt immediately. My mother lunged forward, her perfectly manicured hands aggressively grabbing my forearm. Her grip was painfully tight, fueled by pure, unhinged desperation. She yanked me roughly away from the center of the stage, dragging me toward the muddy, unpaved edge of the property line, where the mahogany decking ended and the toxic swamp began. Thomas followed closely behind us, his face pale and entirely devoid of his usual aristocratic arrogance. "Harper, please, you have to stop this right now," Victoria begged, her voice cracking as she dragged me into the dirt. "Tell the police it is a massive misunderstanding. Tell the press you made a mistake with the audit. Tell them anything. You have to call this off." I effortlessly pulled my arm out of her frantic grip and smoothed the sleeve of my charcoal suit. I looked down at the mud staining the edges of her expensive designer shoes. "I am not calling anything off, Victoria," I replied with absolute icy detachment. "The police have the evidence. The investors have the ledgers. The press has the story. The demolition of your fraudulent empire is already in motion, and I am simply standing here watching the structural collapse." Thomas stepped forward, his breathing ragged and shallow. He looked around, wildly terrified that a journalist might overhear his next words. He closed the distance between us, completely abandoning his pride. "You do not understand what you are doing to us, Harper," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling with genuine terror. "We put everything into this resort. Everything. We took out a massive $2 million high-interest loan against the family mansion to provide Marcus with his initial seed capital. We gave him the money to secure the permits and host this exact gala. We bet our entire lives on this property." Victoria suddenly collapsed. The woman who had spent my entire life looking down her nose at me, mocking my career and treating me like a pathetic, unwanted burden, physically dropped to her knees in the contaminated dirt. Her expensive silk dress soaked up the muddy water, but she did not care. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, looking up at me with tears streaming down her ruined, tear-stained face. "If this project fails, the lenders will foreclose on our house by the end of this month," Victoria sobbed, her voice echoing with total despair. "We will lose the mansion. We will lose our memberships. We will have absolutely nothing left. We will be completely homeless, Harper. You cannot do this to us. We are your family. We are your blood." Thomas dropped to his knees right beside her, the mud completely ruining his custom-tailored suit trousers. The man who had sneered at me and thrown a $10,000 check in my face just days ago was now groveling in the dirt at my feet. "Please, Harper," Thomas pleaded, reaching out a trembling hand to grasp the hem of my trousers. I stepped back quickly, refusing to let him touch me. "We made a terrible mistake. We were blinded by the potential payout. But you are a brilliant forensic accountant. You control that blind trust. You can fix this. You can transfer the real estate to Marcus so he can appease the investors. You can pay off our mortgage with your own assets. You have to save us from this nightmare." They were kneeling in the toxic mud, begging me to rescue them from the catastrophic consequences of their own malicious greed. They had forged my deceased grandfather's signature. They had stolen a deed bearing my name. They had aggressively kicked me out of my own home and ordered bulldozers to destroy my sanctuary. And now, facing total financial ruin and federal prison time, they had the unmitigated audacity to invoke the concept of family. They looked up at me, their eyes wide with desperate, pathetic hope. They truly believed that because I was their daughter, my innate sense of duty and obedience would ultimately override their profound cruelty. They believed that seeing my own parents groveling in the dirt would break my resolve and force me to play the role of the loyal, forgiving child they had always demanded I be. They were waiting for me to reach down, pull them up from the mud, and wipe away their massive self-inflicted debts. I stared down at them, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, satisfying closure. I looked down at the three people kneeling in the contaminated mud at my feet. The damp earth was already staining the knees of my father's tailored trousers and seeping into the expensive fabric of my mother's dress. Chloe had crawled over to join them, her face a smeared, desperate mask of ruined makeup. They were no longer the arrogant, untouchable family that had relentlessly tormented me. They were a pathetic, broken trio, completely stripped of their wealth, their social standing, and their false superiority. For 33 years, I had endured their casual cruelty. I had sat silently at family dinners while they mocked my career choices, calling me a boring spinster who lacked vision. I had watched them siphon away the affection and support I craved, pouring it entirely into their golden child. And when they finally saw an opportunity to enrich themselves at my expense, they hadn't hesitated for a single second. They had forged a dead man's signature, stolen my legal inheritance, and gleefully handed me a $10,000 check while ordering me to vacate the only sanctuary I had ever known. "You are asking me to save you," I said, my voice cutting through their pathetic, overlapping apologies with the precision of a scalpel. "You are asking me to use my own assets to pay off the predatory loan you took out to finance the destruction of my property. You are begging me to rescue you from the exact trap you built with your own blinding arrogance and greed." Victoria reached out again, her trembling, mud-stained fingers hovering just inches from the hem of my charcoal trousers. "Harper, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "We will lose everything. The bank will take the house. We will be ruined. We are your family. You cannot just turn your back on us." I did not step away this time. I stood perfectly still, letting her feel the absolute impenetrable wall of my indifference. "Family." I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. "Did you consider us family when you forged my grandfather's signature to steal my inheritance? Did you consider us family when you dragged a moving crew into my home and ordered me to pack my life into cheap cardboard boxes? Did you consider us family when you laughed in my face at a Michelin star restaurant boasting about the millions you were going to make by selling me out?" Thomas lowered his head, staring blankly into the mud. He had no defense. He had no excuses left. The slick, confident real estate tycoon had evaporated, leaving behind a terrified old man facing catastrophic financial ruin and impending federal indictments. "You demanded I leave my property so you could build your empire," I continued, my voice echoing across the toxic marshland. "You wanted to demolish my sanctuary to erect a monument to your own massive egos. Well, I am just making sure the demolition is thorough." Chloe let out a high-pitched, hysterical wail, burying her face in her hands. She had finally realized that her life of private jets, designer handbags, and endless luxury was permanently over. She was going to be the wife of a convicted federal felon, drowning in massive legal debt with absolutely no trust fund to fall back on. I looked at the three of them one last time, committing their absolute destruction to memory. I wanted to remember this exact moment whenever the inevitable misplaced guilt tried to creep in. I wanted to remember the mud on their clothes, the terror in their eyes, and the absolute certainty that they had brought every single ounce of this devastation upon themselves. "I am not your safety net," I stated, delivering the final fatal blow to their desperate hopes. "I am not the quiet, obedient daughter you can abuse and manipulate for your own financial gain. You dug this grave with your own hands. Now you get to lie in it." I turned my back on them without another word. I did not offer a tearful goodbye. I did not engage in any further dramatic arguments. I simply walked away, the sharp click of my heels against the mahogany decking serving as the final punctuation mark on our relationship. As I walked back toward the main viewing platform, the chaotic scene was reaching its crescendo. The federal authorities had officially secured Marcus. His wrists were firmly locked in heavy steel handcuffs, his arms pinned securely behind his back. The arrogant, charming developer who had swaggered into my driveway just a week ago was now a sweating, hyperventilating criminal being read his Miranda rights in front of the entire city elite. The investors, having realized their $15 million capital pool, was entirely squandered or legally frozen, were viciously demanding answers from the remaining police officers. The journalists were absolutely frantic, their cameras flashing relentlessly, capturing every second of Marcus being aggressively marched toward a waiting black and white squad car. The beautiful classical music had long since died, replaced by the chaotic symphony of sirens shouting billionaires, and the desperate, pathetic sobbing of my family kneeling in the toxic mud. I did not stop to watch him being shoved into the back of the police cruiser. I did not gloat or offer him a parting insult. I walked straight past the furious mob, flanked securely by David and Elaine. We moved with the synchronized, untouchable confidence of a legal team that had just flawlessly executed a complete corporate slaughter. My private town car was still waiting at the security checkpoint, the engine idling softly. The valet attendant, who had witnessed the entire spectacular implosion from a safe distance, rushed forward to open the heavy door for me. His eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and profound respect. I slid into the comfortable leather seat and David and Elaine filed in after me. The heavy door clicked shut instantly, muting the chaotic noise of the ruined gala outside. The driver shifted the car into gear and pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving the flashing police lights and the shattered remnants of my family's fraudulent empire far behind us in the dust. 3 months have passed since my town car left the flashing police lights and the shattered remnants of my family's fraudulent empire far behind us in the dust. The news cycle fed aggressively on the spectacular implosion of my family for weeks, plastering their horrified faces across every major financial network and local tabloid. I watched the fallout from the quiet comfort of my city apartment, sipping my morning coffee, while the criminal justice system methodically dismantled the fraudulent enterprise they had tried to build on my stolen inheritance. Marcus never saw the outside of a jail cell after the police shoved him into the back of that cruiser. A federal judge denied him bail immediately, citing the massive sum of missing investor capital and his extreme flight risk. He is currently sitting in a maximum security federal penitentiary awaiting a highly publicized trial for wire fraud, embezzlement, and the deliberate forgery of official legal documents. His sleek, custom-tailored Italian suits have been permanently replaced by a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The aggressive, arrogant real estate mogul who once stood in my driveway and offered me a humiliating pity job is now spending his days staring at blank concrete walls. He is desperately trying to secure a plea deal that might spare him a 20-year sentence, but the investors he defrauded formed a relentless legal coalition to ensure he faces the absolute maximum penalty available under federal law. He has fully realized that his entire downfall was orchestrated from a cramped, windowless cubicle by the woman he thought was entirely powerless. Chloe recognized the sinking ship immediately and sprinted for the lifeboats. She filed for divorce before that fateful weekend was even over, playing the weeping victim to anyone who would listen. She cried to the local press that she had been brutally manipulated by a charming sociopath completely unaware of his financial crimes. Unfortunately for her, the federal investigators did not care about her theatrical tears. They cared about the digital paper trail I had handed them. The authorities swiftly seized her custom Cartier jewelry, her limited edition handbags, and every single luxury asset she had purchased with the stolen consulting fees. Buried under a mountain of astronomical legal debt from her own defense attorneys, Chloe was forced to face the exact reality she had constantly mocked me for. She is currently working a minimum-wage retail job at a mid-tier department store in the suburbs just to make her monthly rent. The golden child who once demanded I fetch her overpriced iced lattes now spends 8 hours a day folding discounted sweaters and fetching different clothing sizes for demanding customers. She is entirely cut off from the wealthy socialites she used to rule over, trapped in a mundane, exhausting life she considers a fate worse than death. The most profound and poetic devastation, however, was reserved exclusively for my parents. Thomas and Victoria learned the hard way that predatory lenders do not care about family legacy or high society status. The day after the gala collapse, the hard money lending firm initiated immediate aggressive foreclosure proceedings on their sprawling suburban mansion. My parents frantically tried to call their wealthy friends, begging for emergency loans, to stop the bank from seizing their property. Every single phone call went directly to voicemail. The city elite had witnessed their public humiliation and the felony fraud accusations, and they dropped Thomas and Victoria with breathtaking speed. They became instant social pariahs, completely ostracized from the country clubs, the prestigious charity boards, and the exclusive dinner parties that had defined their entire existence for decades. The bank seized the mansion, liquidating their remaining assets to cover the predatory interest rates. Today, my parents are renting a tiny, rundown two-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. The aristocratic couple who had gleefully handed me a $10,000 check and ordered me off my own land are now struggling to pay their basic utility bills. They have absolutely nothing left but each other and the suffocating, inescapable knowledge that they destroyed their own lives purely out of greed. They gambled their entire world just to spite me, and they lost absolutely everything. They will spend the rest of their lives looking back at the moment they decided to forge a dead man's signature, knowing it was the exact moment they sealed their own doom. As for me, I am exactly where I belong. The crisp autumn wind sweeps across the deep blue surface of the lake, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine. I stand on the newly restored wooden balcony of my lake house, resting my hands against the sturdy cedar railing. The cabin is no longer the dusty, quiet retreat they tried to demolish. It has been beautifully reinforced, modernized, and bathed in the warm golden light of the late afternoon sun. I hold a glass of expensive red wine, letting the rich, complex flavor settle on my tongue. I am not alone. From the open kitchen behind me, the sound of genuine, effortless laughter drifts out onto the balcony. David and Elaine, the brilliant attorneys who stood like an impenetrable shield beside me, are unpacking a massive charcuterie board. A few of my closest true friends from the city are opening bottles of champagne and setting the large wooden dining table. There is no tension here, no gaslighting, no manipulation, and absolutely no conditional love. We are gathered simply to celebrate a victory hard-fought and completely earned. I take a slow sip of my wine and look out over the pristine 48 acres of towering trees and shimmering water. Phoenix Holdings served its purpose flawlessly, shielding this beautiful sanctuary from the destructive greed of people who never truly understood its value. I take a deep breath, inhaling the absolute purity of the air around me. The land is safe. The past is finally buried. I watch the vibrant orange and purple colors of the sunset bleed into the horizon over the water that is finally unequivocally and irrevocably mine. The most profound lesson from these stories is that sharing DNA does not automatically create a true family. When the people expected to protect and cherish you choose cruelty or manipulation, instead, walking away is never an act of failure. It is a brave step toward healing. True family is built on mutual respect, unconditional support, and showing up during our darkest hours. By setting firm boundaries and refusing to accept less than we deserve, we open our hearts to authentic connections and chosen families who truly value us. Have you ever built your own chosen family? Please comment below.